You only actually are going to get one.
Foreign Relations Committee will come to order, and I want to deal with two housekeeping issues, if I could. I know we have a number of people here in the audience, some of whom sometimes like to express themselves. We thank you for being here. In the past, when there have been interruptions, on occasion I've been able to have people unarrested, but we stopped that. So please don't do anything that causes you to have to be escorted out of the room, because then the process continues with being arrested. Is fairly unpleasant, and I would hate to see you go through that process. Secondly, we have a vote. We actually have two votes today, and so which is unfortunate. What we've talked to the floor about doing is adjourning the hearing at about 7 minutes to 6. Everybody rushing down and actually voting on the tail end of the first vote, the beginning of the second vote. There'll be no speaking before the second vote. And then if we could hustle back and keep going. I know General Mattis, Mattis has a meeting he'd like to attend. I know others want to complete our work in an appropriate way. So with that, I'd like to thank Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis for being with us today to share the administration's perspective on the authorizations for the use of military force. We are grateful to both of you for your service to our country and your willingness to come here again as we continue this critical discussion on behalf of the American people. Oversight and debate of the 2001 AUMF is something in which this committee has been engaged for as long as I've helped lead it, beginning as ranking member in 2013. At that time, many of us from both parties sought to craft a revised authority to enable the President to address the threats we face from terrorism while ensuring an appropriate role for Congress. When President Obama submitted an ISIS AUMF to Congress in February of 2015, our committee again held a hearing and debated the issue, but there was really no effort on the part of the White House to actually enact a new authorization. This year we've already held two full committee hearings on this important topic, a public hearing in June with private witnesses and a classified briefing with Secretaries Tillerson and Mattis in August, and we thank you for that. We've been working to schedule this public hearing since that time. Numbers of members both on and off this committee have raised questions about the executive's authorities with respect to war making, the use of nuclear weapons, and from a diplomatic perspective, entering into and terminating agreements with other countries. As I've mentioned publicly, this is the beginning of a series of hearings where our committee will also examine those issues. But today it's my hope we will remain focused on the topic at hand, the 2001 AUMF and the 2002 AUMF for Iraq. The President's de facto ability to initiate conflict has grown in an age of advanced technology, including the use of unmanned drones and war from a distance where large numbers of boots on the ground are not necessary to conduct a very significant military engagement. Examples of significant military actions by recent presidents relying solely on the Article 2 of the Constitution include airstrikes in Kosovo, regime change in Libya, and the April missile strike against the Assad regime in Syria. In his last War Powers Resolution letter to Congress, the President identified the following 19 countries where U.S. military personnel were deployed and equipped for combat: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Kenya, Niger, Cameroon, Uganda, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Djibouti, Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, Cuba, and Kosovo. As this month's deadly attack in Niger proved, those forces can find themselves in combat at any moment. As our men and women in uniform continue to meet threats around the world, I hope that our witnesses can help us examine what the appropriate oversight role for Congress is and how we can work together to ensure that our nation's political leadership is meeting the responsibility to decide when and where our country uses military force. As I stated previously, in this hearing we will focus primarily on the two current authorizations for the use of military force. Unfortunately, the use of lethal force against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups will remain necessary for the foreseeable future to prevent attacks against Americans and our allies. The President, just like President Obama, believes he has the legal authority he needs under the 2001 AUMF to fight ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups. And I agree. I agreed with the Obama administration, and I agree with this administration that they currently have that authority. It is clear that Congress is united in its strong support of the fight against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, and other terrorist groups, and I believe all would agree that the President should continue to act against these threats. Congress has regularly been notified of troop deployments around the world, including the buildup in Niger, and has responded consistently by funding the Department of Defense and its operations against ISIS and terrorists around the world. At the same time, I also believe we should update the AUMF to reflect the current conflict and reassert Congress's constitutional role. But we cannot risk undermining the legal foundation for this critical fight. We must also be mindful that moving an AUMF without significant bipartisan support could send the wrong message to our allies and our adversaries that we are not united and committed to victory. So far, Congress has been unable to bridge the gap between those who see a new AUMF as primarily an opportunity to limit the President and those who believe constraining the Commander-in-Chief in wartime is unwise. And unfortunately, the inability to reconcile this divide without threatening the existing authorization has allowed the status quo to prevail. This committee has always recognized that we have a special responsibility to try to speak with one voice on foreign policy. We have a great tradition of working together in a bipartisan way to advance the national interest. It is my hope that we will be able to do the same on this issue. I thank both of our distinguished witnesses and the members of this committee for the seriousness with which they approach the topic before us today. And I hope that together we can have a productive discussion about a way forward. Our distinguished ranking member, Senator Cardin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join you in welcoming our two witnesses and join you in our strong desire for this committee to operate in a nonpartisan way for the betterment of our national security. And I thank you for conducting this hearing. This is one of the most important topics the United States Senate and this committee could ever consider. Under what circumstances and legal authorities should the United States send men and women into war? Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased that you are reasserting this committee's prerogatives on this issue. I hope that soon we will also be considering the repeal of the existing overextended authorizations for the use of military force from 9/11 and the Iraq War, and a new AUMF tailored to the current terrorist threats. America faces unprecedented crises around the world, from ISIS in multiple countries and al-Qaeda affiliates continuing to plot attacks against the United States, to a worsening nuclear crisis with North Korea, and a newly manufactured crisis with Iran. I am deeply concerned about President Trump's inclination to go to war rather than find diplomatic solutions to these crises. It seems we have U.S. troops deployed almost everywhere in the world. In addition to significant deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, and major deployments in South Korea, Japan, and Europe, U.S. forces are and have been engaged in counterterrorism operations in Yemen, Somalia, Ethiopia, Libya, Chad, with extensive advice, train, and capacity building efforts in many more. 2 weeks ago, we learned that 4 servicemen were killed in Niger in circumstances that are still unclear. Their mission and the mission of what many may be as many as 800 U.S. troops in Niger is also unclear. The loss of these 4 courageous soldiers, Sergeant LaDavid Johnson, Staff Sergeant Dustin M. Wright, Staff Sergeant Brian C. Black, and Staff Sergeant Jeremy W. Johnson, show the danger faced by men and women who are deployed around the world, whether they are deployed with the expectation of combat or not. Our hearts are with the families of these soldiers. They serve their country courageously, and their families deserve the respect and appreciation that all men and women should receive after losing a loved one. During this hearing, I'm going to be asking the witnesses some specific questions about the Niger incident, the mission these soldiers were performing, and the legal authorities for their deployment. That's our responsibility, this committee's responsibility. If our witnesses are unable to answer these in open hearings, then I'm going to ask that you return to provide this committee a classified hearing. I think that we and the American people are now asking, if the United States is fighting and dying in Niger, where else are U.S. forces put in harm's way? Some information has been provided to the Congress on this issue, including the June 27 notice to Congress that the chairman referred to. But there has been inadequate explanation of what activities are actually being done and under what legal authority. That is this committee's responsibility to deal with the authorization. Protecting the American people from terrorism stemming from threats around a world is certainly important, but I think there needs to be more public discussion and light on these activities, because I do not think the American people want the United States conducting a global, endless shadow war under the radar, covert, and beyond scrutiny. There have been developments since this committee last conversation on this topic with the secretaries in August. First, ISIS control of contiguous territories in Iraq and Syria have been broken, with hundreds of ISIS fighters killed and hundreds more surrendering. Second, the crisis with North Korea has gotten worse, with North Korea testing both the ICBM with the ability to reach the United States and thermonuclear device amid a bitter war of words and threats between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. Third, President Trump has even threatened the use of military options in response to the crisis in Venezuela. And finally, I'm aware that we cannot discuss all the aspects of the use of the authorization for military force in this meeting. The Foreign Relations Committee has jurisdiction over the AUMF and security assistance in the Senate and an obligation to provide oversight as to how they can be used. Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson, I will be asking you to commit to come up shortly to this committee and brief us in a classified setting on the use of the 2001 AUMF, including for counterterrorism purposes. As I said at our hearing in June, the 9/11 and Iraq AUMF have now become mere authorities of convenience for presidents to conduct military activities anywhere in the world. They should not be used as the legal justification for the administration's military activities around the world. I am not convinced that the evolving threat of ISIL to the United States and to our friends and allies necessitates committing more of our brave men and women to ground combat operations, and certainly not under the rubric of the 9/11 AUMF against al-Qaeda for their attacks in Washington and New York. I'm going to repeat one more time for the record what that says. The 2001 AUMF said the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, and purposes. As one who voted for that AUMF when I was in Congress in 2001, I never intended, and I think all of us never intended, it would still be used today to justify the use of military force against ISIS. I just want one last point, if I might, Mr. Chairman, and that is, I think it's very clear that under this authorization, there is no authorization for the use of military force against North Korea unless there's absent an imminent attack upon the United States or upon forces or allies in this region. I'd be interested in hearing the Secretary's belief as to what authorizations exist today for military operations against North Korea. Finally, it's important for Congress to better exercise its oversight over the use of force now. The United States has relied for too long on military force as the first response to the problems of terrorism, insurgency, and instability abroad. In this administration, one wonders whether it's become the first and only response. It has proposed dramatic increase in the defense budget while the foreign affairs budget's been slashed by 30%. Very soon, practically the only tools left in the U.S. foreign toolbox will be the massive hammer applied everywhere for lack of better options. We need to both authorize and to set limits on the use of that hammer. In so doing, perhaps the administration will rediscover the necessity, the value of diplomacy, development, and support for human rights as the means to build safer worlds for everyone, especially the United States. I know that our two witnesses share the commitment to our national security and the importance of diplomacy and the use of our military, and I look forward to their testimony.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. We thank both of you for being here today. You have tremendous respect by almost every member of this committee. We support your efforts around the world. And if you could limit your comments to about 5 minutes or so, you're going to have a lot of questions. I know any written materials that you'd like to have entered into the record will be done without objection. And I guess we'll start with you, Secretary Tillerson. Again, we thank you for your extraordinary efforts on behalf of our country.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, distinguished members, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. I know the Senate's desire to understand the United States legal basis for military action is grounded in your constitutional role related to foreign policy and national security matters. I understand your sense of obligation to the American people well in this regard. In the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, or AUMF, Congress authorized the President to, quote, to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons. Congress granted the President this statutory authority, quote, in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. The 2001 AUMF provides statutory authority for ongoing U.S. military operations against al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces, including against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. The administration relies on the 2001 AUMF as a domestic legal authority for our own military actions against these entities, as well as the military actions we take in conjunction with our partners in the coalition to defeat ISIS. The 2001 AUMF provides a domestic legal basis for our detention operations at Guantanamo Bay, where the United States currently detains members of al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces. The 2001 AUMF also authorizes the use of necessary and appropriate force to defend U.S., coalition, and partner forces engaged in the campaign to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. In Syria, the efforts of the U.S.-led coalition are aimed at the defeat of ISIS. The United States does not seek to fight the Syrian government or pro-Syrian government forces. However, the United States will not hesitate to use necessary and proportionate force to defend U.S. coalition or partner forces engaged in the campaign against ISIS. The President's authority to use force against ISIS is further reinforced by the authorization for use of military force against Iraq, or in more plain terms, the 2002 AUMF. In addition to authorities granted to the President by statute, the President has the power under Article 2 of the Constitution to use military force in certain circumstances to advance important U.S. national interest, including to defend the United States against terrorist attacks. As an example, President Reagan relied on his authority as Commander-in-Chief in 1986 when he ordered airstrikes against terrorist facilities and military installations in Libya following a terrorist attack by Libya in West Berlin, which killed and wounded both civilians and U.S. military personnel. The United States has the legal authority to prosecute campaigns against the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and associated forces, including ISIS, and is not currently seeking any new or additional congressional authorization for the use of force. The 2001 AUMF remains a cornerstone for ongoing U.S. military operations and continues to provide legal authority relied upon to defeat this threat. However, should Congress decide to write new AUMF legislation, I submit to you several recommendations that the administration would consider necessary to a new AUMF. First, a new AUMF authorities must be in place prior to or simultaneous with the repeal of old ones. Failure to do so could cause operational paralysis and confusion in our military operations. Diplomatically speaking, it could cause our allies in the global coalition to question our commitment to defeating ISIS. And potential repeal of the 2001 AUMF without an immediate and appropriate replacement could raise questions about the domestic legal basis for the United States' full range of military activities against the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and associated forces, including against ISIS, as well as our detention operations at Guantanamo Bay. Second, any new authorization should not be time constrained. Legislation which would arbitrarily terminate the authorization to use force would be inconsistent with a conditions-based approach and could unintentionally embolden our enemies with the goal of outlasting us. Any oversight mechanism in a new AUMF also would have to allow the United States the freedom to quickly move against our enemies without being constrained by a feedback loop. Third, a new AUMF must not be geographically restricted. As is the case under the current AUMF, the administration would need to retain the statutory authority to use military force against an enemy that does not respect or limit itself based on geographic boundaries. As ISIS's fraudulent caliphate in Iraq and Syria has crumbled, it has tried to gain footholds in new locations. As was discussed with the Senate during a closed Defeat ISIS briefing in July, the United States has a limited military presence in the Lake Chad Basin to support partners, including France, in their counterterrorism operations in the region. This information is also being conveyed to you in multiple periodic reports submitted to Congress consistent with the War Power Resolution. The collapse of ISIS's so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria means it will attempt to burrow into new countries and find new safe havens. Our legal authorities for heading off a transnational threat like ISIS cannot be constrained by geographic boundaries. Otherwise, ISIS may reestablish itself and gain strength in vulnerable spaces. The United States must retain the proper legal authorities to ensure that nothing restricts or delays our ability to respond effectively and rapidly to terrorist threats to the United States. Secretary Mattis and I, along with the rest of the administration, are completely aligned on this issue. We fully recognize the need for transparency with you as we respond to what will be a dynamic regional and global issue. We will continue to regularly update Congress and to make sure you and the American people understand our foreign policy goals, military operations, and national security objectives. I thank the committee for supporting our efforts and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Secretary Mattis, we thank you also for being here and your extraordinary service, not only as Secretary, but through many, many years in our military. We especially appreciate the fact that the two of you work together constantly to deal with issues in a unified voice, and we very much appreciate that. With that, if you'd begin.
Thank you, Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, members of the committee. It is appropriate we appear before you today to explain what we're doing from DoD's perspective in our counterterrorism campaign and why. This has been a long 16-year global conflict characterized by a very different form of warfare, specifically terrorism, fueled by extremism aimed at innocents around the globe. Traditional campaigns to protect our people must adapt to the reality of today's non-traditional transnational character of this fight. The 2001 and 2002 authorizations to use military force, or AUMF, remain a sound basis for ongoing U.S. military operations against a mutating threat. In the aftermath of the deadly 9/11 attack and to prevent future acts of international terrorism against the United States, Congress passed the 2001 AUMF, finding the President has, and I quote, authority under the Constitution to take action to deter and prevent acts of international terrorism against the United States. The 2002 AUMF provided the President with authority to, and I quote again, defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq, unquote. Previous administrations have cited these statutory authorities to address the threat posed by terrorist groups in Iraq and Syria. As demonstrated by presidents from Washington to Lincoln, Wilson, FDR, and their successors, it lies firmly within any president's constitutional authority and responsibility as the elected commander-in-chief to designate who presents a threat to our country. To date, this Article II authority, reinforced by the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, has been used to take action against al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, and associated forces. Following the December 2011 pullout of our forces from Iraq and the outbreak of civil war in Syria, al-Qaeda in Iraq regained strength and rebranded itself as ISIS. In 2014, under its new name, ISIS unleashed mayhem in the heart of the Middle East, building its self-described caliphate and attracting the allegiance of terror groups from the Sahel to Southeast Asia, groups which plan, inspire, and conduct external attacks around the globe, attacks that include San Bernardino, Paris, Orlando, London, and the Philippines, to name only a few. Though a statement of continued congressional support would be welcome, a new AUMF is not legally required to address the continuing threat posed by al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS. Article 2 of our Constitution, the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, provides sufficient legal authority for us to engage and defeat the current threat, which we are doing by working by, with, and through our allies and partners. That said, any new congressional expression of unity, whether or not an AUMF, would present a strong statement to the world of America's determination, demonstrating, as Senator Kaine has stated, quote, an important message of resolve to the American public and our troops that we stand behind them in their mission, unquote. With that for background, I would like to note that to successfully prosecute the counterterrorism campaign, any debate on a new or revised AUMF needs to incorporate the following factors. First, the 2001 and 2002 AUMF should not be repealed. After numerous court cases and debates, there appears to now be a general consensus by all three branches of government that these two AUMFs provide sufficient authority to prosecute operations against al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and we believe ISIS. Repealing the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs would only cause unnecessary policy and legal uncertainty, which could lead to additional litigation and public doubt. The uncertainty accompanying that situation could only signal to our enemies and our friends that we are backing away from this fight. It would stall our operations, immediately reduce Allied commitments and support, and create significant opportunities for our enemies to seize the initiative. Additionally, repealing the AUMF without new authority would deprive us of the ability to detain dangerous enemy combatants who could then be released to fight again. Second, any new AUMF must not be time restricted. For example, President Trump's South Asia strategy is conditions-based, not time-based, because war is fundamentally unpredictable. We cannot put a firm timeline on conflict against an adaptive enemy who would hope that we haven't the will to fight as long as necessary. Instead, we must recognize that we are in an era of frequent skirmishing, and we are more likely to end this fight sooner if we don't tell our adversary the day we intend to stop fighting. A conditions-based AUMF would not lessen Congress's authority. The power of the purse remains firmly vested in your hand, should the executive branch not present a persuasive case for continuing the campaign. Lastly, any new AUMF must not be geographically constrained. As has been stated, these are not traditional threats. This is a fight against a transnational enemy, one that does not respect international borders and does not place geographic limits on their areas of operations. So necessarily, to defend our country, we must be prepared to swiftly engage this global enemy in conjunction with our allies and partners. Regardless of the adaptations we must make for the common defense, I recognize that it is incumbent on the Department of Defense to keep Congress fully informed to fulfill its constitutional role, and I will continue to do so. Accordingly, as our troops on the battlefield carry out the last 300 meters of American foreign policy to protect our way of life, I ask Congress for your continued support and commitment to ensure we retain the necessary authorities to take our own side in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to reserve my time for interjections and defer to our ranking member and then move down the line. For those of you who may have stepped in late, I know giving guidance to senators is a useless effort, but we're going to have a whole series of hearings. This one hopefully is mostly focused on the 0102 AUMFs, but we'll have a series of hearings looking at other war-making powers, whether it's North Korea, nuclear issues. We've had members on the committee and off ask about these issues. So just know that, but I know you're going to ask whatever you wish. With that, Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to welcome Senator King to our committee. It's not the first time he's attended our hearings, and it's nice to have you here. I would ask consent that the statement from Human Rights First be made part of our record. Put a statement on record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson, I think we all agree that we're not anxious to repeal the 2001 authorization without a new authorization being enforced. That's certainly been the game plan. But I would point out that there are significant differences here about whether the 2001 authorization covers the military operation, counterterrorism operations against ISIS. Many of us believe that is not included in the 2001, but we do agree that Congress needs to make sure that there is authorization to pursue our counterterrorism efforts. As I indicated in my opening statement, operational decisions on the use of the AUMF for counterterrorism, I understand, would not be appropriate in an open setting. So my request, and I would ask that you respond to it, that you would be willing to return in a closed session in order that the Committee of Jurisdiction on the AUMF has a better understanding of how the operational decisions are being made.
Certainly, Senator.
Thank you.
Absolutely, sir.
I appreciate that. I understand the Chairman's admonition about North Korea, but I just really want to put on the record, would you agree that there is no congressional authorization for the use of military force against North Korea? I understand the President's authorities under Article 2, there's an imminent threat against the United States, he has certain powers. But as far as congressional authorization, there is no authorization. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
I believe the President has Article 2 authority only.
Thank you. I want to get to what happened in Niger and sort of understand where we are, because there is also limitations on the introduction of troops under the War Powers Act, limiting to 60 days. And as I understand it, our troops in Northern Africa have been there much longer than 60 days. Can you just explain very briefly what our mission was in Nigeria when the tragedy occurred, and under what legal authority those troops were there?
I can, Senator. The troops are there under Title 10 in a train and advise role. The letter from the President, from President Obama in 2013 to the President Pro Tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House talks to the total number of U.S. military deployed there in 2013 was 100 in furtherance of U.S. national security interests, as President Obama's report to you. That continues to be the case at this time.
But the specific mission that they were participating in, as I understand it, went beyond that. Am I wrong on that?
The mission of those troops on that patrol was a combined patrol, which means they were with Niger troops. And they were on a patrol where they're teaching them how you do what's called key leader engagement. I'd have to wait until I get the full investigation in to give you a more complete answer. But they are there with the Niger troops to train and advise them consistent with the original intent. They were sent there under the previous administration, continues to be the intent today.
So this is not 2001 authorization?
No, sir. This is under the Title 10 and requires us to report to you under that authority.
I understand. Thank you for that answer. I want to know how far we would go in pursuing military options in that region of the world. Boko Haram's a horrible group doing terrible things. Do you have the authority under the 2001 to pursue Boko Haram atrocities?
These troops were there under Title 10, of course, but as far as Boko Haram goes, they have pledged allegiance to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and so either way, they have associated themselves with the very group that authorization is targeted on.
So without any further authorization from Congress, you believe you have authorization, if a determination is made, to deploy whatever force is necessary to go after Boko Haram, including ground troops?
If the President detects that there is a threat from them against us, our interests, I believe he would have the authority to designate that group, yes, sir.
Well, yes, I understand the threat, but the threat is related to the 2001 threat, is what you're saying. That this is a group that is, terrorist activities are endangering.
If it's an associated group, he would under
so
that.
So he could declare that to be associated group?
No, he didn't. Boko Haram declared that they were an associated group.
They did, but the President could authorize them as an affiliate group and then use the full force of our military, including ground troops, without further restrictions?
Right now, Senator, our troops are there under Title 10. I don't want to speculate about that because that's not what they're doing right now. I'd have to go back and study it, but I believe a group that declares its allegiance to either Al-Qaeda or ISIS would then be part of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, yes.
Yeah, but my question really is related to how far he could commit our military to these types of campaigns. When we were attacked on September the 11th, we recognized the need for a military response, and we certainly understood that American troops are going to be called upon to protect our country. I'm not sure that Congress envisioned that we would have the potential of ground troops in Northern Africa in combat missions. And if I understand you're saying, unless we modified this AUMF, you would feel that you have adequate authorization to commit American ground troops in Northern Africa?
Senator, if the President determined they're a threat to the United States and under the AUMF, if they say they are allied with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, yes, sir, I believe so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first start out by thanking both the secretaries for their service to the country. Let me pick up on the point of ground troops. Secretary Mattis, in your testimony, you talked about a 16-year global conflict, totally different than anything we've really witnessed in the past. I remember when we had this discussion a couple of years ago with the advent of ISIS, trying to rewrite a new authorization for use of military force. There's an awful lot of discussion about limiting ground troops, no ground troops. Secretary Tillerson, I think you said in your testimony, you talked about the caliphate is basically ended, is it not? Or really darn close?
Well, we have liberated a large amount of area in Iraq and Syria, but that fight is not over yet.
Secretary Mattis, is there any way we could have done what we've done so far at the caliphate without ground troops?
I don't believe so, Senator.
And yet, 2 years ago, we were debating in this committee replacing the authorization for use of military force with one that would have restricted President Obama's and his replacement, his successor, his or her ability to use ground troops. That would have been a big mistake, wouldn't it?
Senator, generally speaking, when you don't tell the enemy in advance what you're not going to do, that's not a wise, even if you don't choose to do it, there's no need to announce that to the enemy and relieve them of that concern.
You know, in the 2001 authorization, I personally don't think the 2001 applies to this situation. I really don't when you read it. But by precedent, it does. But it doesn't restrict the President's use of force. It says to use all necessary and appropriate force. And then it goes on to describe what those nations, what those organizations really are. In a real declaration of war against Japan and Germany, Congress declared that the President is authorized and directed to employ the entire naval military force of the United States and the resources of the government to carry on the war against, in this case, the government of Germany, and to bring the conflict to a successful termination. All the resources of the country are hereby pledged by the Congress of the United States. So both in 2001 authorization and the declarations of war against both Germany and Japan, there were no restrictions. We pledged all necessary resources of this country to the defeat of our enemy. In both of your testimony, you laid out 3 conditions. One thing I want to clear up, Secretary Mattis, you said we should not repeal the 2001-2002. Later on, you talked about without a new authorization. There's no difference in your testimony, correct?
No, sir.
You can repeal them as long as you have something else in its place.
There are some lawyers who will say it's good to hold on to what you have, even if you pass a new one that perhaps changes it in some way. But
so is there a slight difference between your 2 testimonies then? You would prefer keeping the 2001-2002 AUMF in place?
I'd have to see what came out next, Senator, but right now I'd say yes. We've been through a lot of difficulty trying to get the 3 branches of government aligned on this.
Okay. I'm not disagreeing with you in any way, shape, or form. You both said that if there's a new AUMF, it should not be time restricted. You both said it should not be geographically restricted. I was waiting for the 4th, but neither one of you said this. There should be no operational restrictions. Do you believe there should be operational restrictions as we contemplated a couple of years ago, no ground troops or something of that type of restriction? Secretary Tillerson.
No, I do not think we can restrict operations given the way this particular enemy morphs, changes its tactics. As we saw with the emergence of ISIS, we start with what might be a fairly limited group of terrorists who then are able to overrun large territories and amass armies, essentially their own armies of tens of thousands. That requires a very different use of force than trying to chase and defeat terrorists that are making their way through the jungles in smaller numbers. This is an enemy that changes its name, It moves across borders. It is a non-state actor, and it has morphed and changed over this 16 years, which I know is part of why this is such a vexing issue, because it does not fit a declaration of war. Certainly, it doesn't fit the criteria that Congress has used in the past for declarations of war.
It's a totally different enemy than we faced in the past, but this has been a 16-year struggle. I don't think it's going to be over anytime soon. Secretary Mattis, can you describe what has changed in the change of the administration that has allowed us to defeat the caliphate in relatively short order compared to what had been happening the previous 2 years?
Senator, what we did was we changed the tactics. We accelerated the number of partnered units that had American forces with them, not to do the fighting, but to call in air support. The change in tactics was one that where we would surround the enemy first so they could not fall back and reinforce the next site, thus making it harder. And you saw the surround tactics used in Mosul, in Tal Afar, in Tabqa, in Raqqa. And those are the big changes, sir, as we accelerated the campaign, but also lessened the chance that foreign fighters could escape to return home or to reinforce the next position.
Would you say it's true that we've allowed the commanders on the ground to make the decisions to defeat the enemy rather than direct them here from Washington, D.C.?
I have delegated authority to the appropriate levels, yes, sir.
Both of you seem to indicate that continued congressional support would be welcome if it was a statement of unity. But it has to be an authorization that does not restrict the military's ability to defeat our enemy. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I agree, Senator, assuming strong and very robust feedback loops to the Congress to keep you fully informed.
I have no further questions. Again, thank you for your service.
Thank you, Senator Udall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your service, and thank you for being here today. Secretary Mattis, the existence of multiple local militia forces in Iraq remains a major problem as ISIL is driven out. Kurdish aspirations of nationhood may be just the tip of the iceberg, and I'm concerned we're ending up on multiple sides of a complicated conflict in a post-ISIL Iraq and Syria. How many different groups are the Department of Defense advising and assisting in Iraq?
Sir, we advise and assist the Iraqi security forces only in Iraq, and I would just mention that Secretary Tillerson just returned from there, and this issue was brought up with the Prime Minister. If you would say anything, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, the Prime Minister is asserting authority himself over other various militias, including Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, which are by and large Iraqi forces. They are Iraqi citizens who are fighting under militia arrangements, including the Peshmerga forces of Kurdistan during the war to defeat ISIS, to liberate Mosul, to liberate large parts of Nineveh and other provinces. These forces put themselves under the command of Prime Minister Abadi. So there are multiple forces, but I think as the Secretary indicated, our support is through the Iraqi forces working with Prime Minister Abadi and his authorities.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because Secretary Tillerson, it was reported that the Iraqi Prime Minister was pretty blunt in his response about Shia Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, stating that they are already home and they're not going anywhere, and that maybe U.S. forces should leave. If U.S. forces are told to leave, will we depart Iraq or will we stay uninvited as our forces are doing in Syria, and under what legal authority will they remain?
Senator, the Prime Minister, I never heard the Prime Minister say U.S. forces should leave. What he did clarify is that, as I said, many of the PMF forces are Iraqi Shia forces, so they are Iraqi citizens. My comment was regarding foreign fighters that may have come to Iraq. We know there are foreign fighters in Syria, and my comments were that any foreign fighters, particularly those from Iran, needed to leave Iraq and go home. Certainly, PMF Iraqi citizens This is their home. They will remain. But I think the Prime Minister has also made it clear as to his expectations of how these forces will organize themselves or put their arms down and just rejoin their villages as citizens.
Yeah, but we've reached this new phase, and I think this is a real possibility that I'm asking you about. If U.S. forces are told to leave, will we depart Iraq or will we stay uninvited, as our forces are doing in Syria, and under what legal authority?
We will remain in Iraq until ISIS is defeated, and we are confident that ISIS has been defeated.
Under what legal authority?
Under the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs. Now, having said that, we are there also at the invitation of the Iraqi government, and Prime Minister Abadi has given me no indication that he is in any particular hurry to have us depart.
To Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson, do you agree with the assertion that this fragmentation of security forces will pose difficulties to the Iraqi government maintaining order in areas that the U.S. government recently regained control of? What is your advice to ensure that these areas do not see resumed sectarian violence now that the fight with ISIL is nearly over? And does this necessitate U.S. troops on the ground?
Senators, areas have been liberated. We are working with the coalition partners and with the United Nations and other non-governmental organizations to create stability around liberated cities in particular, as well as villages. And that means having the military forces, the armies, pull back out of the villages, allow our coalition to enter those villages, undertake demining of the villages so that it's safe for people to return, and then begin the process of training local, basically police forces. And we have a number of coalition partners that have undertaken that activity. So as we are liberating areas, we are preparing security forces, local security forces, to transplant the military forces. Prime Minister Abadi made this direct observation to me. He said, I have to get my armies out of the cities. They're not policemen. They're not trained to be policemen, and they're not equipped to be policemen, and I have to replace them with trained security forces to carry out police activities and provide security for the civilians as they return. There's a lot of work to do to stabilize these areas, but that is how we will lock in the military gains that have been achieved with the liberation.
Secretary Mattis, do you have a comment on that issue?
It's the Iraqi forces and, operating under Prime Minister Abadi that have liberated these areas. It's not any other armed groups. Now, there are PMF forces that are engaged with them, but he has insisted that they fall under the authority of his field commanders. That is being imperfectly done. I wouldn't say it's happening in all cases, but you have seen the successes enjoyed so far. And we are moving now against Al-Qaim with Iraqi forces to restore the border against Syria. So you see it unfolding in that direction. The next step is exactly what the Secretary of State has laid out.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I think Senator Flake, you're next. If it's okay, maybe we'll go with about 3 minutes of your questions and then come back and you can resume if that's okay. All right.
That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. I think that here, in the Senate, we aspire to be more than just one cog in a feedback loop. This is the body with Article 1 authority to declare war and to authorize the use of military force. I understand the importance in looking at your 3 items that shouldn't put a new AUMF in place, or shouldn't repeal the old one until a new is in place. No time constraints, we'll get to that in a second, not geographically limited, and the AUMF that Senator Kane and I have introduced, the bipartisan AUMF, I think meets the conditions of the 1 and 3. But number 2, with regard to time constraints, anybody want to hazard a guess of how many in this body, right here, in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, were in the Senate when the 2001 AUMF was passed? Not one. Not one member of this panel was in the Senate when the 2001 AUMF was passed, or the 2002 for that matter. 7 of us were in the House during that time and voted on it, but not one has had the opportunity to weigh in on it 16 years later. I would argue that the concern about giving our adversaries notice that we have to vote on something may be an issue, but it's overwhelmed in a big way by not having Congress buy in and not having us have skin in the game. It simply allows us to criticize the administration, Republican or Democrat, if we don't like what they're doing, because we haven't weighed in. We haven't said our piece. We haven't voted on this. So I would simply say that any concern about having to come back, we have a 5-year sunset on ours, 5-year. That's pretty long. But Congress needs to weigh in. We have to make sure that our adversaries and our allies, and most importantly, our troops, know that we speak with one voice. And so I hope that as we go along, we can talk about the relative importance of signaling that we might leave or might not finish, and not having Congress weigh in at all, and to go for 16 years before we actually weigh in or have any skin in the game. We, as I said, ought to aspire to be more than just part of a feedback loop. Article 1 authority is more than that. So with that, I'll hold back. And
Thank you, Bertie. If you'll keep 4 minutes and 15 seconds on Senator Flake's time, if we could all sprint over and sprint back, you'll start again as soon as we get back, and we'll recess for about 14 minutes, I hope. Thank you. You're welcome to come into the back or do whatever. Senate Foreign Relations Committee is now coming back out of recess. As with the Senate, we had one member who kind of lollygagged around and took a little longer than we thought. It's the story of the United States Senate, but we're glad to be back in session. Senator Flake, if you will, continue your work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We talked a little before the break about reasons we need an AUMF, and I mentioned how few people were actually here. Nobody on this panel voted in the Senate on the AUMF. In the House, fewer than 100 members of the House were there when the 2001 AUMF was passed. I think a total in the Senate, nobody on this panel, but only 23 members of the Senate were here to vote on the AUMF. And so it simply helps. We've got to have a situation where the Congress is more involved here. I understand what you say that a new AUMF would be welcomed but not required. Just for the benefit of everybody here, no administration would ever concede that you need an AUMF because the absence of it would suggest that what we've been doing for 16 years would be illegal, or certain activities that we've undertaken. So I think we all understand that the administration will say that no new AUMF or no new authorities are needed. But whether or not they are needed to provide a legal basis, they're certainly needed politically. And we can't continue to go on in a situation where 70% of the House and the Senate has never voted on an AUMF and has no reservation at all to criticize whatever administration is in power in their use of military force because they didn't vote on it. And we can't continue to go year after year after year without doing that. But specifically on a question here with regard to Niger, I understand that you say that's Title 10 authority. You express concern about not having authorities that expire so as not to tip off the enemy that we might leave. Explain Title 10 authority with regard to, now that's part of the NDAA that we gratefully, it's the one authorization bill that we pass every year, but what if we weren't going to pass that next year? If we failed in our duty to do it, what would that do?
Well, we would, I believe, Senator, we would still have Title 10 authority under the U.S. Code. So we would not, we would have trouble probably getting appropriations if we didn't have the NDA, the authorization. But I think that under the U.S. Code, we still exist as a military. So I'd have to turn to my general counsel, sir, to give you a better answer.
You mentioned, General Mattis, in your remarks that we still in Congress here have the power of the purse, and that maybe should be sufficient. There was one member of our body who said when he was briefed on what was going on in Niger, he said that Congress, we would need to decide whether or not we want to authorize this operation through the appropriations process. Now, for us authorizers, that ought to be a hit right here, that only the Appropriations Committee in this body has authority to look at what we're doing and decide whether or not appropriate authority exists. And through the appropriations process, give that authority. I would suggest that this committee ought to stand up and say, that's not enough. That's not enough. Let's pass a new AUMF. So I know that I hope Senator Kane will go into the AUMF that we have proffered. It is gaining momentum, certainly, and support. And I hope, above all else, that we can come to a point where we speak with one voice overseas, whether it's use of diplomacy or use of military force. And under the current situation with a 16-year-old AUMF, I would suggest that we don't. And our adversaries, our allies, and our troops need to know that we do. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. If I could, just for clarification, when you say Title 10, you're talking about the Train and Equip program?
That's correct, Chairman. Basically, we have the authority under Title 10 to carry out these kind of partnering activities. Yes, sir.
Throughout the world?
if the President directs it. Yes, sir.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. You're both patriots, and thank you for your service to the country. I want to maybe get back to this question of exploring the limits of that Title X authority, but I wanted to build upon a question preview that Senator Cardin referenced, and that's on the existing authorities in North Korea. President has talked about our military options, should we choose to use them in North Korea, and I just wanted to make sure that we understand the range of authority that the President has today with respect to potential military operations in the Korean Peninsula. Would you both agree that absent a strike against the United States or the imminent threat of a strike against the United States, the administration would need congressional authorization to engage in military activity against North Korea?
Well, Senator, I think it would depend, again, on all circumstances, and it's a fact-based decision. I think clearly today we're there under Article 2 authorities, and Article 2 is really, if you look at historically, it's been grounded in kind of two criteria. One is to protect United States persons, property, and national security interest. And secondly, it's been used for circumstances that do not rise to the level of a declaration of war. I think that is the circumstance we have in the peninsula today in Korea. So it is a question of the threat, the imminent threat, the nature of the threat, as to whether the President then would exercise his authorities without the need of further congressional authorization. So it'll be fact-based, and all of those will have to be considered.
Secretary Mattis?
Yes, I believe under Article 2, he has a responsibility, obviously, to protect the country, and if there was not time, I could imagine him not consulting or consulting as he's doing something along the lines, for example, of what we did at Sharat Airfield here in Syria when we struck that, and the Congress was notified immediately. This was after the chemical weapons use by the Assad regime. But in this case of North Korea, it would be a direct, imminent, or actual attack on the United States that I think Article 2 would apply.
I think I would agree that if it's an attack or an imminent attack, and we can all split hairs as to what the definition of imminent would be, but let me try to get to the bottom of that. Would the possession of a weapon, a nuclear weapon, capable of reaching the United States fulfill the definition of an imminent threat to the United States? Would the simple possession of a weapon that is capable of doing great damage to the United States be sufficient to qualify as an imminent threat?
Well, again, I'm always reluctant to get into too many hypotheticals, because the possession could be sitting in an underground, not ready to be used condition, or possession could be sitting upright on a tail about to be launched. So again, I think it would have to be fact-based and given consideration as to the circumstances around an imminent threat.
Secretary Mattis?
I fully agree with Secretary Tillerson. I think this is an area that a number of facts would have to bear on the problem in order to give you a complete answer, Senator.
I thank you both for your answers. I think the primary fact is whether there is an attack or an imminent attack. I think other than those two facts, you need to come to Congress for authorization, but I appreciate your answers. Secretary Mattis, I wanted to drill down a little bit more on the Title X authority. You certainly have Title X authority to conduct training missions abroad. You're using that authority in Niger. Today, you've properly notified Congress. You referenced President Obama's notification. But how do you answer concerns that our constituents may have when it looks as if a training mission is something more than training, that we are actually putting American troops out in harm's way? partnered with local forces, engaged in activity that imperils U.S. men and women. To many folks, this didn't look like a training mission. It did look like we were side by side with domestic forces, but we were actually helping them carry out pretty critical mission components. How do you address concerns that some of our constituents have that a training mission can very easily morph into something that looks much more like operational and offensive capabilities that are unauthorized by Congress?
It's a great question, Senator. When you look at why did President Obama send troops there, why did President Trump send troops there, it's because we sense that as the physical caliphate is collapsing, the enemy is trying to move somewhere. And so those troops are there. Most of them are providing, frankly, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support, intelligence support, refueling support. There are some doing this train and advise mission. In this case, we're trying to build up the internal defenses of another country so they can do this job on their own. The French have carried the burden for this, have taken severe casualties at times in this mission. We're supporting them. But in this case, since April, I believe, and we'll get the specific numbers once the investigation comes in, over 24 patrols in this area with no enemy contact. I think it was reasonable to think they could go out and continue training these troops without the idea they're going into direct combat. But that's not a complete answer. I need to wait until I get the investigation to fully appraise you.
But you referenced the falling apart of the caliphate at the beginning of that answer, and so that suggests that this might not be a Title X authority mission. This might be a 2001 AUMF mission, and if that's the case, then, okay, you're not
I misled you then.
Okay.
This is a Title X train and advise, and we're trying to prepare them if, as the caliphate falls apart, their country comes under attack so they can defend their own population. You'll remember Boko Haram nearby and the 276 girls they kidnapped. It's a real problem up in that region, and we're trying to get them in a position where they can defend themselves and do it according with law of armed conflict in a very complex environment. This is tough training, sir.
Thank you very much. Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Mattis, you said in the past, you said again here today, that a new AUMF by this Congress would send a message of resolve to our troops and to our enemies. I absolutely agree with that. I'd like to get into the law, though, the legal components of this. Legally, there are at least one, it seems, would have to concede that there's a principle, there's a logical argument that the 01, 02 AUMFs don't apply or now have a highly attenuated application to current circumstances. 2001 AUMF was in response to 9/11. It was directly in response to 9/11, albeit written broadly. 2002 AUMF was directed against the Saddam Hussein regime. In fact, it was invoked here today, but the language of that AUMF says a threat posed by Iraq. And then in 2014, ISIS leadership, al-Baghdadi, actually disavowed very publicly any association with al-Qaeda. Secretary Mattis, you indicated that a terrorist group, I think it was Boko Haram, but a terrorist group was covered by the 01 AUMF because they swore allegiance to al-Qaeda. Now, by that same logic, if ISIS broke with al-Qaeda, why would the 2001 AUMF apply to the fight against ISIS?
Yeah, Senator, what we've seen is these groups come apart, go back together. They change their names as often as a rock and roll band. They're keenly aware that they've got certain legal strictures on our side that they can take advantage of. We call it lawfare, where they actually use our laws against us. We've seen it. We read their mail. We know what they're thinking in many cases. It is an associated group because if you look at the photographs we have from intelligence that shows who is leading in Baghdadi's outfit, there's a remarkable resemblance to other photographs we have under al-Qaeda in Iraq. So when the same group in the same area seems to be spawning from the same people, a disavowal is something that's of interest, but it's not necessarily compelling, especially since they seem to have many of the same tenets to their ideology as the group they disavow, and I'm not
seems like
sure I would call them highly attenuated in that circumstance.
That's my characterization.
No, I
respect
understand.
yours,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary. So it seems like these arguments could be made both ways. They sworn allegiance, therefore they are covered by the AUMF. And then secondarily, well, you know, that factor is not all that important in our consideration based on a range of other factors. It might be helpful to lay out what multi-factor analysis legally your attorneys are looking at to help make these decisions. Secretary Mattis, on January 27, 2015, you testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. You said the following, quote, "We've observed the perplexing lack of detainee policy that's resulted in the return of released prisoners to the battlefield. We shouldn't engage in another fight without resolving this issue up front. Treating hostile forces, in fact, as hostile." When asked about that in the hearing, you continued, quote, "I think that what we have to do is have a repeatable detainee policy so that when we take them, we hold them. And there's no confusion about their future, not among the enemy's minds, certainly not among our own." Do you stand by those statements, sir?
I do, Senator.
Why do you believe it's important up front to ensure that there's no confusion regarding our nation's ability to detain enemy combatants under the law of war until the end of hostilities?
Senator, when we release people and eventually we find them back on the battlefield fighting us, when Rommel's Africa Corps was taken prisoner in World War II in North Africa, we didn't let them go because they said, well, I was only a tank driver, I wasn't a gunner, and let them take another shot at us at Normandy. We held them in prison camp until the war was over. I think that is a rather straightforward proposition. We take our own side in this.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So if this body were to pass another AUMF, would you support an effort that seeks to eliminate any uncertainty whatsoever regarding our nation's ability to detain enemy combatants under the law of war until the end of hostilities?
For those taken overseas, yes, sir. I just want to make sure you understand I'm not talking about people here in the United States who are taken. Yes, sir.
Nor am I, so thank you. Another legal point, going back to the law here, I would argue you invoked litigation risks. I would argue that the further away we get as a country from 2001 or 2002, the more attenuated the relationship exists between our ongoing fight against associated forces and that period of time in which a previous Congress, working with a previous commander-in-chief, passed an AUMF. The litigation risk is only going to grow. So kindly consult with your attorneys and give me their analysis about why I have it wrong or right, but I think I have it right. Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis, both of you over the course of this hearing have indicated that there are three essential elements for a new AUMF, and I think you worded them differently, but I think they are distilled down to no lapse in authorities, no time constraint, and no geographic restriction. Is that a correct and fair summary of the elements that
yes, sir.
need to be in there? Thank you. Well, I just note for the record that the AUMF I introduced on March 2nd, Senate Joint Resolution 31 meets all of those criteria. So I think it certainly satisfies that. I'm going to pivot to a different topic. Secretary Mattis, you mentioned ISR assets. And in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee on March 9, 2017, General Waldhauser, who's commander of AFRICOM, stated in his written testimony that only approximately 20 to 30% of Africa Command's ISR requirements are met. The general wrote that this shortfall in ISR limits situational understanding, support to operations, and fails to offer threat indications and warnings. Secretary Mattis, could you please discuss AFRICOM and DoD's ISR shortfalls and the operational impacts of those shortfalls and what we can do to help?
Yes, sir. The ISR assets are insufficient basically worldwide. I can go to a number of other combatant commanders from the Pacific, even in the Mideast, CENTCOM, certainly EUCOM, and they would all say they have shortfalls. As you know, we've been under continuing resolutions for many of the last 10 years. We have been under budget reductions, and eventually real capability is insufficient. At the same time, I think in this case, General Waldhauser is 100% correct, but that force, again, was in an area where a reasonable person looking at the last several months would say contact was not imminent, was not likely to be imminent. And so you look at how you prioritize it. There's a finite amount of ISR assets, and we deal them out. Frankly, like gold coins to the various commanders.
Thank you both for your service.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, for this important hearing. And thank you, Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson, for the service you've rendered to our country and for the men and women you lead in command. I think it's important that we as a committee come together in a bipartisan way and provide you with an updated authorization for the very demanding and difficult work that your men and women are doing around the world. I think the tragedy in Niger, the loss of 4 American soldiers, helped focus us on the fact that we've got citizens and we've got senators who are unclear on exactly where in the world we are engaged against this morphing, changing enemy in a new era of skirmishes, as you put it, sir. And in the opening list you gave of roughly, I think, 19 countries, I'll tell you it's striking. A majority of them are on the continent of Africa, in a region that is not that familiar to many senators and many Americans. So I'll just assert that I believe it to be in our national interest to have a renewed, clearer, strengthened authorization of the very difficult work that you and the folks you lead are doing around the world. And I take seriously the risk presented of potentially emboldening our adversaries and undermining confidence of our coalition partners if we do it in a way that is rough-hewn. But at the same time, it just defies my sense of our role to accept that a 2001 AUMF, where, as Senator Flake put it, fewer than a third of the currently serving Congress voted for it, has become so attenuated, I think was your phrase, so convoluted, that it's hard to trace a path from 2001 and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to young American men and women serving in the Philippines or in Yemen or in Niger. So we have to do this, I think, together. And I find it beyond my ability to get my head around that we must authorize an unlimited war that has no limits of geography, of time, or of an oversight mechanism. So I commend my colleagues who've put together what I think are strong drafts and that attempt to tackle this. And I frankly think on both sides we're going to have to make concessions in order to provide our warfighters and our diplomats with the authorization that makes it clear what we intend to do and for how long we intend to do it. I think that strengthens our country. I think that shows democracy at work, but it also means we're going to have to take some risks. Talk to me, if you would, for a moment about how we make sure that our citizens, that our senators, know where we are fighting beyond the current system of notification, because I think it is not fully effective. And what do you think is the appropriate level of public transparency for military deployments outside of areas of active hostility? Is it helpful? Is it important? And how do we strengthen accountability to the Senate and the public of where we're deployed, and what are the limits on that?
Senator, I would just say that in my department's case in FY16, we submitted 901 reports to the Senate, which for the number of days you're in session is about 6 a day. It has been added in FY17, another 175, so we'll be submitting 7 reports a day. Under the War Powers Resolution notification that comes in, Niger has been reported every 6 months under the previous administration, as well as under our current administration. The most recent in June reported about 645, thanks to the appropriation by the Congress to work on an airfield. We have actually got probably 150 more there right now, engineers working on an airfield with the money you provided to make the airfield that will provide more ISR opportunity for our troops in that region. So I think the most important thing is we look at the reports we're giving you to see if we're just burying the important information inside a mass of reports that pour into you every day, literally, and make sure that maybe tier one issues that, and this would be, you would decide tier one, that we're highlighting that information to you to include in any closed hearing briefings that filled in any gaps you sensed.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Secretary Tillerson.
Well, Senator, I think what you've really put your finger on is what is, I think, concerning, I'm hearing concerning this committee and others, and that is the level of transparency and understanding of where our forces are deployed and in what role they're deployed and to what levels they're deployed, and what's the expectation for the likelihood of combat engagement. But I also think that when I consider the current AUMF, and I don't want to pretend to know what the intent of Congress was in 2001, but quite frankly, maybe the intent recognized that this was a completely different situation than we've ever faced before. This was not a sovereign state actor that we could do a war declaration against. And war declarations, I think as Senator Johnson pointed out, don't have timelines. We didn't tell the Japanese we're going to come out and fight for 3.5 years and then we're going home. And we've done that. We've done that under this AUMF. We've announced withdrawal from Iraq, and we see what happened. ISIL emerged and created an enormous caliphate. So anything that signals our intentions, this enemy takes advantage of that. We have now learned that lesson multiple times. So I do appreciate that the issue over what congressional control or oversight there is for this authorization. On the other hand, Article 1 gave the Congress the right to declare war. Article 2 gave the Commander-in-Chief the right to conduct the military affairs. And I think the founders recognized in writing Article 1 and Article 2 that you can't fight war by consensus. You can't fight war with a collective approach. There has to be one Commander-in-Chief to fight the war because someone has to take the hard decisions to win. And so the separation is there, I think, in Articles 1 and Article 2. And the reason there is not a declaration of war here is because, as I indicated earlier, the situation, the circumstances don't give rise to a declaration of war, which then puts into motion a number of other authorizations. So I think the authority has been properly used by the Congress in the 2001 AUMF. As Secretary Mattis, I think, would welcome a strong statement from the Congress, but in many respects, the Congress can express its will now, 16 years later, and say this authorization is still valid, and it's serving the purposes of this war against this very unique and unusual enemy that we will fight for we don't know how long, or for where, or with what forces. That is the nature of this fight that we're in.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to thank both of you. I'll just comment in closing. Having spent time in West Africa, I am particularly concerned about the ways in which associated forces morph and change, affiliate and disassociate, and the way in which who we are fighting metastasizes, more at their choice and direction and timing than ours, and how it's possible for something like Boko Haram to split into two and to become now two enemies, one Al-Qaeda affiliated, one ISIS affiliated, but without a significant amount of direction or funding or control from a core enemy. This is a different kind of fight than we've been in as a nation before. And I do think our constituents expect some sense of strategy, trajectory, timeline, and cost. Yet I am not blind to what you raise as the very real risks if we undermine the confidence of our coalition partners and our troops by failing to deliver a strong consensus AUMF. I look forward to working on that with you both, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Rankin.
I will say before turning to Senator Isaacson, with few exceptions, I've been here 11 years, I really haven't heard a member specifically raise questions or criticize efforts that are underway against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. So I know everybody's concerned. I mean, I know that when this began, no one expected in 2001 that we'd be continuing as we are today. I understand that, and I would like for us to strive for a balance. But in fairness, and we may hear it, I know there's one member here that may express that in just a moment, but I really haven't heard a member go down to the Senate floor and criticize the Bush administration as it relates to al-Qaeda now, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, or this administration yet, relative to the activities they have underway. It does seem to me that the Senate and the House, generally speaking, do support the efforts that are underway. So with that, Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Mattis, I want to thank you very much for mentioning the name of those 4 soldiers in Niger who lost their life last week. In particular, I want to be sure and mention Dustin Wright from Lyons, Georgia, who was one of the 4 troops who lost his life. I want to thank you and repeat what was told to me in a Kroger grocery store in Marietta, Georgia this past weekend when I was home about a lady who came up whose son is in the United States Army, volunteered for the United States Army, is overseas now. She talked about how proud she was for him to be serving under people like you and the leadership we have in our country. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for that, but also tell you that's what the people on the streets are telling me. Now, Senator Coons and I go way back. In fact, the chairman and I traveled to Africa and went to Darfur. We were the 2nd and 3rd senators ever to go to Darfur, if I remember correctly, and saw some of the horrible things that are happening in Africa. And I appreciate, on the one hand, what Senator Coons said about how complex the continent of Africa is and how many players there are and how hard it is to keep up. But I think that underscores the reason you just can't write an AUMF with restrictions, or try and be so prescriptive in the way you prescribe the geography where they can fight, or the tools that they can use, or anything like that, and do so without risking the life of your own troops. I was in the military. It's been a long time ago. We had muskets back then, but I remember the limitations on your ability to serve and what you could do, the rules of engagement, were affected, I'm sure, by the AUMF at the time. I'm sure the AUMF, the rules of engagement flow down from the AUMF, am I right?
Yes, sir.
So when we're writing an AUMF here to restrict our soldiers, geographically, methodology-wise, or any other way, in the end we're potentially affecting the rules of engagement they have on the ground in countries where there are no rules, like Niger and the other countries we talk about in Africa. So I think we have to be very much aware the people who are working for us, or the people who we're working from are our constituents. The people who are working for us are our soldiers in the field, our airmen, our soldiers, and our naval personnel. And they operate under rules of engagement where they are limited to what they can do to carry out their mission. And those limitations are somewhat affected by the AUMF that exists at the time. So I just want to bring that point out. We have to be very careful about what we're not just dealing with limitations we as senators want to have our country to have. We're limiting the people who are out there as volunteers fighting to save our country day in and day out in some very dangerous places. Am I right?
Well, you are, Senator, in terms of geography or time, this sort of thing. And I think that people run on hope. And if the enemy hopes we're going to quit on a certain day, or if they know we won't deal with them if they step over a certain border, then the enemy's going to do exactly that. As our sergeants say in the military, the enemy gets a vote.
Absolutely. By the way, your comment about a rock and roll band, it piked something in my mind. My staff's going to get mad at me for doing this. I'm ad-libbing now, but I've come from Athens, Georgia, and went to the University of Georgia. It has founded a lot of bands. One of the best ones is Widespread Panic, and that's what happens in continents like Africa, the type of countries right there. You're not dealing about an enemy that's just a country. You're talking about groups within those countries who are waging war in their own country that we end up getting engaged with one way or another. My next question, Secretary of State Tillerson, from the standpoint of any limitation whatsoever, from your testimony, I take it that you don't think there should be that if we were to write a new AUMF, it ought to simultaneously go into force and replace the one that exists today. There should be no gap. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator. We cannot afford to have any gap in terms of our authorities.
And like Secretary Mattis, you don't think there should be any limitation, geographic or otherwise, in that AUMF?
No, Senator. This is the nature of the enemy we're confronted with today.
And we have to be ready to make the decisions that those lack of limitations allow us to make at the drop of a hat in today's type of warfare and today's type of conflict around the world.
I think we have seen how quickly this enemy can collect itself, raise forces, and overrun territory. We saw that happen at an astounding level of speed in Iraq.
My last comment, I've been giving a lot of thought to this issue for a lot of reasons. One of them is North Korea, which is a serious problem that all of us recognize as serious. I don't know we all recognize it's as serious as it really is. But I was in college in the early 60s. John Kennedy was president of the United States. And it was a period of time where the Russians put missiles in Cuba and had the potential of launching missiles 90 miles north in the United States and into Miami. And that was you talk about a huge issue, got everybody's attention. For those few, Miss Sheen wasn't here. She wasn't even born then, I know, but most everybody in this room wasn't here, but there were tough times and perilous times. President Kennedy did a great thing in that conflict because there was a book, 7 Days in May, that described each of them. But he took it, we got to the point where we had done the aerial photography, we had the evidence, it was clear that the missiles had been installed in Cuba. Khrushchev had beat his shoe on the table and talked about how he wasn't going to take them out. And Kennedy had done everything but tell him yes, he was, and left themselves wiggle room. And finally, President Kennedy and his brother, Bobby, sat down one night and decided it was time to draw a line that he would have to cross. And they used an embargo on an island as a line, a red line in the sand, so to speak. And now I know North Korea is not an island. I don't want anybody to think I'm comparing that. But what I am saying is if there was a non-lethal but provocative way to force them to have to come into the game that they've started with, the North Koreans, we're getting close in my mind to that point. I know y'all are thinking about it every day, and the last thing I would want you to do is talk about it because he's over there in North Korea watching our television right now anyway, getting his intelligence. But we're getting close to that particular time in the history of our country where there's an example of how you go to the next step without necessarily risking a life, but by drawing the line in the sand that somebody's got to cross, or else you do end up engaging with them. So I just wanted to throw that thought out. I didn't want you to have to respond to it, but I thought it was a great example of leadership by a great president at that time, and a time that certainly was similar to what we face today with North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your service. During the last Congress, and again this past January, I introduced the Restricting First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act with Representative Ted Lieu. This bill would ensure that no president can launch a first-use nuclear attack against any target, anywhere, without a declaration of war from Congress. Under existing laws, the president possesses unilateral authority to use a first-use nuclear strike on anyone, anywhere around the world, even in the absence of a nuclear attack against us or our allies. There is no question that since the dawn of the nuclear age, it has been essential for the president to have clear authority to respond to nuclear attacks on the United States, our forces, or our allies. But in my view, no one person should have the power to launch a first-use nuclear strike without congressional approval. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, the President has authority to repel sudden attacks as soon as our military and intelligence agencies inform him of such an attack. Nothing in our bill changes the President's authority to use nuclear weapons against anyone who is carrying out a nuclear attack on the United States, our territories, or our allies. What we do propose is a common sense step to check any president's authority to launch a first-use nuclear strike by prohibiting such a strike unless explicitly authorized by a congressional declaration of war. Since the dawn of the nuclear age 7 decades ago, we have been relying upon cooler heads and strategic doctrine to forestall the unthinkable, but too often those kind of ad hoc measures seem less reassuring than ever. Do you think, Secretary Mattis, that the President has the authority to launch a first-use nuclear strike without congressional approval?
Senator, first, I would not say it's ad hoc. It's extremely rigorous. The discussions and the the step-through process for decision-making, and I just prefer not to talk about a hypothetical that we have never confronted since we basically, in the post-World War II time to today, we've never had something like that come up.
Do you contemplate a circumstance within which the President of the United States could launch nuclear weapons against another country where that country has not launched nuclear weapons against us?
If we saw they were preparing to do so and it was imminent, I could imagine it. It's not the only tool in the toolkit to try to address something like that, but I believe that congressional oversight does not equate to operational control. I think that we have to keep trust, keep faith in the system that we have that has proven effective now for decades.
Well, again, we're in a circumstance now where the President talks, at least elliptically, to preventative war, which would mean the United States launching nuclear weapons, potentially, against North Korea, as we did in Iraq, that is not nuclear weapons, but starting a war in order to disarm Saddam of nuclear weapons. That was at least the ostensible justification that Dick Cheney gave 2 days before the war began. So, in your opinion, is there a circumstance under which we would be able to use nuclear weapons if we had not been attacked with them?
The question again, please, Senator.
Again, I'm coming back to this question of whether or not there is a scenario under which a first strike using nuclear weapons could, in fact, be used by the President of the United States without consulting any member of the United States Congress, much less the entire Congress in its entirety.
Senator, again, it's a hypothetical. I think that if there was an imminent strike and it was the only way to stop it, and I'm not saying that would happen, there may be different tools, conventional tools to stop it, but he has a responsibility to protect the country.
Well, I think it's too important a subject for the United States Congress not to be informed as to what the circumstances are under which we would use nuclear weapons first. I think that it's imperative for you and Secretary of State and others, if necessary, to give us the classified briefing as to what those circumstances might be, as to when you think they would have to be used. They could be used without ever consulting the Congress at all. Would you be willing to come up and to give us a classified briefing on when you think a first use of nuclear weapons is appropriate when we have not been attacked?
Senator, I have a record of never being reluctant to come up and speak. Some hearings are best in closed session, but I am often reluctant to speak to hypotheticals, but I can certainly go partway down that road in terms of what might occasion something like that, like imminent attack, yes.
Well, in my opinion, no human being should have the authority to use nuclear weapons if there has not been an attack. We are the most powerful military in the world, Air Force, Navy, Army. If there's a threat that is conventional, then we have a conventional response. But if nuclear weapons are used, I think that there has to be a process by which the United States Congress is consulted. This is not something, in my opinion, which is any longer hypothetical. I think it's something that President Trump contemplates, although I will add that we introduced the legislation when Hillary Clinton was ahead by 7 points last September. So it has to do more with whether or not any president should have this authority unfettered. What would be the process right now to use nuclear weapons? What would the president have to go through? Could you walk us through what that consultation would have to be?
We'll walk that through in another hearing, if it's okay. And just for what it's worth, we've had, I know that you have asked about this, and I appreciate that. Other members have asked the same. We've met with CRS and understand that there hasn't been a hearing on this topic through them, that it could be incorrect, since the 1970s. And so we do plan to have a hearing to walk through how the process works. You know, there's multiple scenarios that come into play, and I think a full hearing would be much better than a 1-minute response.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Risch.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for your service. You know, I've been 9 years on this committee and the Intelligence Committee, and I've sat through literally dozens and dozens and dozens of debates, arguments, hearings, witnesses on AUMF and trying to redo the 2001, 2002, or replace them and do a new one. And I'm struck with a number of things after all that time. Number one, everybody wants to do something. Everybody wants a new AUMF. And the parties on both sides are working, I really believe, in good faith. It certainly isn't a partisan exercise. There's people on both sides working on a bipartisan basis to do this. The second thing that has struck me is I have seen dozens of iterations of what a bill would look like or a resolution would look like. And the problem is we get high-centered on the details. And after listening to all this, I'm a little pessimistic about whether we can actually do something new. The old system is in place, and with all due respect to my really good friend, Senator Flake, you know, none of us voted on the original 2001, 2002, but we vote every year on this when it comes to the appropriations. In fact, at times, we vote multiple times a year, depending upon how many CRs that we do. So Congress could stop fighting ISIS if we wanted to. You know, we all the time put restrictions on funding as to what the money cannot be used for, and we're pretty successful in that regard when we do it. The problem is, of course, we both know that the will is different than what we'd like to see in a perfect world. So I agree with you. We didn't vote on it directly, but all of us here have had a say every single year. In any event, you know, the Founding Fathers had a really good idea. They said, look, the first branch of government, the legislative branch, should decide when we're going to war. Really good idea, because we're not made up of the military branch. The military branch is the one more likely to pull the trigger quicker than the civilian branch is. So they put that in our hands. The other idea they had, which was also an excellent idea, is that Congress wouldn't run the war. As has been pointed out here, you can't have the politicians running the war. You need a commander-in-chief, and that was a really good idea. The difficulty, of course, today is things have changed so dramatically since the time that was done. War fighting has changed. On top of that, those guys couldn't possibly have thought that a war we're fighting is against non-state actors, against people that are dispersed all over the world with a common idea of what they want to accomplish, and it's so different today than what it was then. So where does that leave us? I think we've got the constitutional provisions, which are pretty clear. We've got the War Powers Act, which you can argue is constitutional in all or in part, and we're moving forward, but we don't seem to be headed towards a resolution on this AUMF. I'd like to get your thoughts on an issue that's only been touched on. We've talked a lot about terrorism because that's where the fight is. But I think North Korea has been raised a couple of times, and to me, that is the biggest issue that we have. If you're going to describe big, what happens when somebody knocks on the door of the Oval Office and says, "Mr. President, North Korea has just launched. What do you want us to do?" And look, there's no time for an AUMF. There's no time to get the lawyers involved to determine what can or can't be done, and somebody's got to make that decision. So I appreciate Chairman's thoughts that we should have a separate hearing on this particular issue. But I'd like to get your thoughts on what. And I know the lawyers are on both sides of this. I've heard cadres of lawyers argue whether the president has this power, whether it's limited, whether Congress has that power. I'd like to get your thoughts under the scenario I've just talked about. As far as the terrorism thing, We deal with that regularly in the Intelligence Committee and on this committee. Tell me about North Korea. What happens? What happens if somebody knocks on the door and says, Mr. President, they've launched? In summary, I'm not going to ask you to give us anything classified out.
The first step, of course, would be that our ballistic missile defense forces at sea and in Alaska, California, the various radars would be feeding in, and they would do what they're designed to do as we make every effort to take them out. The response, if that's what you're referring to, after the immediate defense, would of course depend on the President and laying out options, a wide array of options, I will tell you, and in alliance with our allies as well, I might add, because many of them have roles to play here, have indicated they'll be with us. And we would take the action the President directed, and I'm sure the Congress would be intimately involved.
Well, and of course, under the scenario I've outlined, this is a matter of minutes, not a matter of days or even hours.
Defenses will go, sir. We don't
get that.
do any. I mean, the President will be woken up or whatever, but our commands are. We rehearse this. I will just tell you, routinely.
I get that.
I'll just leave it at that in this open session, sir.
Secretary Tillerson, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think as Secretary Mattis indicated, we do have defensive mechanisms which are in place. There would be some judgment made as to the effectiveness of those, and then there'd be some judgment made of whether a necessary and proportionate response is required. You know, one of the strengths of the last 70 years has been the deterrence. The fact that no president, Republican or Democrat, has ever forsworn the first strike capability. That has served us for 70 years. So I think any consideration of foregoing that does change in a I think, a very material way, that deterrence, the strength of that deterrence. So
I agree, Mr. Secretary, and also it seems to me that the enemy we're dealing with here with in North Korea, that deterrence issue does not seem to be phasing them, because either a man would have to be absolutely crazy or incredibly stupid to not know what was going to happen after that. My time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So I think in that scenario, it's about a 15 to 20 minute process before response takes place. And again, I think it would be very edifying for us to walk through that. Before I turn to Senator Kane, Secretary Mattis, you've I know, said on several occasions that you think it would be great if Congress spoke with one voice on this issue and showed support. And look, I hope we're going to have an outcome here that does that. But does anybody get any sense anywhere in the world that the United States and the people that are within the United States are somehow divided over fighting ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and groups that spin off?
Chairman, there have been times when allies and even I think our adversaries have been convinced we were willing to give up and pull out of certain theaters. Yes, sir, I think so. But those are operational aspects. I think as far as our antipathy.
And you're really you're speaking more there to what happened in Iraq and what happened. What are you speaking to when you say them being concerned about it?
Pulling out, announcing the pullout from Iraq, sir, obviously that was one of the reasons ISIS had a chance to grow. When we were talking about pulling out of Afghanistan, we had a total of 50 nations in the field fighting the enemy. As we were pulling out, we've now dropped to 39. That's turning around, and those allies are coming back on board, adding troops based on the rollout of our South Asia strategy. So you can see what happens as both, when we started pulling out of Afghanistan, people thought, well, maybe the Taliban will want to make peace then. Some of us doubted that, but in fact, they accelerated their campaign. So you see the enemy's response, you see allies, 11 of them, leaving the field when they saw us saying we were going to leave. So yes, it does have an effect, but I don't think it's that the enemy believes the American people are suddenly willing to vote for the kind of things our enemy exists for, believes in, but they at times question whether or not we have the will to stand the strain.
Thank you very much, Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question of this hearing is whether we can be in an endless war with no congressional vote against newly formed terrorist groups all over the world forever. We're in year 17, and I've heard testimony before that this could go on for generations with no vote of Congress. The recent deaths of 4 American troops in Niger and the news about a June death of a Green Beret in Mali while deployed there on a special forces mission raise many questions about the geographic scope of America's military campaign against terrorism. And I repeat what I've often said in the last 4 years. It's time for Congress to have a public debate and vote about an authorization for U.S. military action against non-state terrorist groups. Many of us believe we're legally required to do so. Others believe, if not required, we would be wise to do so. Secretary Mattis has testified in support of this on earlier occasions, as has the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford. Our troops and the American public deserve an open debate and vote on the extent of military operations, if not in year 17, in year 30, in year 40, in year 50. Mr. Chairman, I want to introduce for the record a contract solicitation issued by the Navy in 2014 seeking to contract with an entity able to provide casualty evacuation, search and rescue, and personnel recovery in connection with, quote, high-risk activities in Africa. It designates 14 nations, 5 of which have been identified to Congress in War Powers notice letters. I find no fault with the contract solicitation. You have to plan, but I believe that this level of planning, and this is from the Obama administration era, demonstrates a contemplated scope for American counterterrorism activity in Africa far greater than what has been briefed to Congress and significantly greater than what the American public understands. To our witnesses, Senator Flake and I have introduced an authorization for military action against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban to replace 2001 and 2002, and to finally engage us in our Article I responsibility. You signed a letter to Congress on September 5th opposing the proposal. I'll introduce that for the record as well. I think we can stipulate that this administration, like the 2 preceding administrations, believes that the 2001 authorization in 2002 gives it broad power in this area and would rather not have any congressional revision. But we have a job to do, the Article I branch, so let me ask you about your reasoning. Your first objection to the letter to the proposal is that, quote, the legislation would arbitrarily terminate the authorization 5 years after date of enactment. This is inconsistent with the conditions-based approach in the President's South Asia strategy. Such a provision could also unintentionally embolden our enemies with the recognizable goal of outlasting us. The annual NDAA we pass every year expires every year, but Congress still manages to pass the next NDAA. And appropriations bills and continuing resolutions expire every year, and then they're followed by subsequent appropriations. And other critical national security legislation must have legislation like FISA, for example, commonly have an expiration date and a need for congressional reauthorization. Do either of you view the annual expiration of the NDAA or defense appropriations as Congress, quote, arbitrarily terminating our support for the military?
No, sir. We have several hundred years that this works. It may be imperfectly with continuing resolutions, but I suggest the AUMF is substantially different.
Do you have any evidence that the annual expiration of the NDAA or defense appropriations unintentionally emboldens our enemies?
The continuing resolution is certainly inhibited our ability to adjust the military to the modern threat.
Do you think the enemies are emboldened by thinking that we won't pass a CR or won't pass an appropriation?
I don't think they understand those kind of intricacies, whereas an AUMF is a statement of purpose.
You count on being able to get the next NDAA passed and the next appropriations bill passed because you have confidence in your request and you have confidence in Congress to take seriously the need to defend the United States. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, Senator. My reservation is that, for example, I have several dozen people who've been waiting some time for hearings in order to give me the civilian oversight of the Department of Defense we need and respond appropriately in keeping Congress informed. And I can't seem to get floor votes on some and certainly hearings for others. So I think it's the speed at the at the speed of relevance for something like this, we'd want to make certain that where you get into what could be construed as not just the oversight, but the management.
You don't doubt the will of Congress to battle non-state terrorist groups, do you, Secretary?
Sir, this war is so non-traditional that I think we are.
I understand that, but you don't doubt the will of Congress to defend the nation against non-state terrorist groups, do you?
No, I do not.
A second objection, if I could, because I'm sorry I'm having to move, is that the resolution includes a definition of associated persons or forces that's inconsistent and could result in unnecessary uncertainty. The definition says associated persons or forces are individual or entities other than a sovereign state that are part of or substantially support al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or ISIS, and are engaged in hostilities against the U.S. armed forces and other personnel. I'm just going to leave that for the record. I think it's crystal clear, and there's no uncertainty about it. The third and final objection in your letter is that the joint resolution would create a cumbersome congressional review process for use of force against new associated forces or in new countries. Let me ask you this. Does the administration object to having to identify to Congress the associated forces we're targeting with military force? To notify us?
I believe that under the Article 2 of the Constitution, the President has the authority to declare a threat to the United States as the elected Commander-in-Chief.
Do you object, does the administration object to notifying Congress of the associated forces against which you're taking military action?
I don't think so, sir. We've been very forthcoming with that very information.
And do you object to the need to notify Congress of the countries where military action is undertaking place? You do that in the War Powers letters, correct?
We do it routinely, sir.
That's all that Senator Flake and I have in our resolution. We require you to notify us about countries and notify us about associated forces, and you can immediately take action against them, subject only to a resolution of disapproval by Congress, which is the current law. Just, if I could just conclude, Mr. Chair, based on the answers in this quick thing, and it's tough to do it so quickly, I have a hard time understanding the opposition to the resolution as anything other than we don't want congressional oversight. There's a 5-year sunset reauthorization with an opportunity to extend, just like we do in FISA, just like we do in the Patriot Act, just like we do in NDAA, just like we do in appropriations. The associated forces definition is extremely clear. The process for countries is not a geographic limitation. It's just a notice requirement that Congress can then affirmatively take steps under the normal rules of the Constitution to rebut. I recognize that the administration feels like it doesn't want any more authority, but to quote my colleague, we're more than a feedback loop. This is a constitutional power, and we shouldn't be putting troops into harm's way and as Congress standing back and trying not to have our fingerprints on this when it's mutating all over the globe. And again, I think it's a forever war, and I worry deeply about handing the power over to presidents to do this without the need to come to Congress at all. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
You did a good job. I do have remaining time. I do want to say that what the senator said is true. I mean, you just have to notify the countries. You just have to notify the additional groups. So that part is not cumbersome. I would ask, and this was going to be a cue from us anyway, but I'd like to know what the problem is with the associated forces. It does appear to be very broad, and I would like, if it takes a classified response, we'll be glad to take it. But I don't understand what the problem is with associated forces, and I think it would be, I actually ask, and I know you'll send me a response to that. I appreciate it. Senator Paul.
I think it shouldn't surprise any of us that administrations, Republican and Democrat, come to us and say they believe in unlimited Article 2 power to execute war. What should surprise and worry us, though, is that it seems like they also argue that they have virtually unlimited power to initiate and to execute war, and that's where the real problem comes here. I'm pretty much like everybody else. Execute the war. I don't want to have you restrained rules of engagement. I want to engage and kill the enemy. But initiation of the war was given to us. Madison wrote that the executive branch is the branch most prone to war, and therefore with studied care we gave that power to the legislature. And so while some would argue, well, we can just not appropriate money, that becomes very difficult. Even in Vietnam, nobody wanted to cut off the money because no one wants to be accused of not giving money to soldiers in the field. So our real only chance of preventing war is not to initiate the war. The problem we have with you coming forward to us and saying, my goodness, you will not even tell us that we're not going to have preventative war or preemptive war with North Korea. This sends a signal, not just that we're willing to do first strike, but what signal does it send to enemies of other nuclear powers, enemies of Russia, enemies of China, enemies of Pakistan, of India, that we're reserving the right, if we don't like what weapon you have and we think it might reach us, we may as well just take you out. I mean, look, Pakistan and India are pointed at each other. You got Israel pointed at Saudi Arabia, pointed at Iran. You have all of these enemies, and if we're going to assert that, yes, we have the right and the will, and we will take preemptive war against a nuclear power, I think that's very troublesome. But if we want to fix it, we should fix it. You know, we complain, administrations want to take too power, we should reassert our power. It's not just us. It's been generation after generation of Congress just acquiescing in this. And while I applaud the AUMF that's being put forward as asserting our authority, if it doesn't limit the authority of the executive, I'm not sure we're a lot better. My problem, the executive branch thinks it's too restrictive. I think we'll still authorize war in 34 countries, at least 7 for certain, but probably 30 some odd. So when we look at this and we want to ask whether or not there should be limitations, whether or not we are prepared to be involved in perpetual war, or whether we're prepared to let any president involve us in perpetual war, we have to think about this. I mean, the war started in the first generation after Muhammad. I mean, when you got Ali Hussein and Yazid the first fighting in 680, they still remember the Battle of Karbala. The Shia still mourn that battle 13 some odd years later. Are we willing just to not have any more votes and say the vote in 2011? No intellectually honest person thinks 2001 has anything to do with this. I promise you that. It says specifically we're going after the enemies who attacked us. ISIS had nothing to do with that. Nobody in Niger has anything to do with 9/11. Other than they have sort of this ideology of radical Islam. But I don't think we gave the executive branch a blanket authority just to go to war anywhere they want against people who they say are a part of radical Islam. Ultimately, there's going to have to be diplomacy involved in this as well. You know, how are we ever going to end the war? Is there ever an end to this war? But really, the crux of the argument is over who has the power. You say you've got it. Dick Cheney once said that it should be unconstitutional to challenge Article 2 authority, which he also meant to be unlimited, basically. The Constitution was very clear. We were supposed to initiate war. Doesn't matter whether it's a state or a non-state actor, initiation of war comes from Congress. And I believe that very strongly. And I think if we all did, we should assert our power. We have the ability to assert our power, and we should resist when the administration, anyone, Republican or Democrat, comes before us and tells us they believe the ability to have preemptive war anywhere, anytime, and they have the ability to continue to fight a war against an ideology wherever they perceive it to be. So I think it's very, very dangerous, and this should be a wake-up call to all of us, and if we can come together. What I would say, though, just passing AUMF is not enough for me, because it should be an AUMF that does give us some hope of someday coming to an end, and someday there will be an end to the war. I see no end to this war historically. I think the war and the answers are going to come from within Islam. I think Islam's going to ultimately have to stamp out. I think we're a target everywhere we go, and yes, we can defeat anyone, but I don't think in the end it ends the war. I mean, we went to Yemen. You guys just did it on your own. So you're in a new war theater now. You're involved with Saudi Arabia there. You got 17 million people on the point of starvation in Yemen. And we're assisting and aiding the Saudis in blockading. We give them weapons. They kill civilians. They killed 150 people in a funeral procession. So when we go to a village and you guys come and say, oh, we got great information, which no one will tell me specifically what the information came from that village in Yemen. But when we went in there, unavoidably, and I don't blame our soldiers, I blame us, the people in charge, but women and children were killed in that village. What do you think? And you say, well, we didn't try to do that. Sure. But what do you think they tell about us in the surrounding communities? What do you think they say about the time the Americans came in the night and women, children, and a whole village is wiped out? What do you think they say about that? They'll repeat that by oral tradition. The same way they remember Karbala from 680 AD, they're going to remember this. So I don't think we can kill more than we create in the process. So ultimately, there's going to have to be another way that involves some diplomacy, some discussion. It doesn't mean we can't resist the enemy, and we shouldn't, but it shouldn't be your power. I'm here to say very forcefully it is not your power. But the only way we'll ever change that is if we as a body stand up and say enough's enough. We are going to reassert the power of the Senate and the power of Congress to determine these things. And we could, and my admonition is to do that. I'm alarmed today to find out that Article 10 basically has us involved in civil wars in Africa. So we can call it any kind of euphemism we want, train and equip, but it sounds like you've got a conflict going on there. You've got conflict going on in Nigeria. We have 6,000 troops in 54 countries in Africa, and we should just blithely say, oh, we were given this authority under Article 10 to be anywhere, anytime. I was alarmed that you were going to justify it with 9/11. I'm even more alarmed that Section 10 or Article 10 sounds like you believe you can be anywhere, anytime, whether there's a war going on or not. And we can say it's train and equip, but I suspect there's more going on in Niger than train and equip. But I don't think there is ultimately a question in there other than a hope that we as a body would pull together and stand up and resist, not because you're bad people, you're good people. You served your country. You want what's best for your country. All our soldiers are. But the balance of power. Madison said we would pit ambition against ambition. So we would check and balance each other. We haven't been checking and balancing the executive branch for 60 some odd years, maybe longer. So we need to stand up, and that's my admonition to our body, and I don't think I'll change your minds, but it is an admonition that we should have a real full-throated debate. I thank the chairman for the beginning of this. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, and my guess is under Title 50 authorities, there is a great deal underway that the American people nor us are aware of, but that's part of what we're dealing with here. Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of you as secretaries for your management of perilous circumstances around the world. Secretary Tillerson, I believe I understood you to say that the retention of the potential for first use with nuclear weapons has been a foundational doctrine that has helped keep the peace over the last, I think you referred to 70 years. Did I catch that right?
Yes, Senator.
Yeah. I would say that maybe not. It has not generally been the retention of the potential for first use. It has been assured destruction, assured retaliation that has kept that peace. And there is a significant difference between the two. And I believe I heard one of you refer to that we hadn't really considered the use of nuclear weapons after World War II. I'm not sure if I heard that right. Did I hear that right?
Senator, I said that we have not initiated the use of nuclear weapons since World War II.
Great, and that would certainly be very accurate, but we have had serious conversations about the potential of using a nuclear weapon as a first-use weapon, both in Vietnam and in Korea. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a CIA document that goes through, it's March 18th, 1966.
There's no objection.
Thank you. It noted they were analyzing, in the context of a debate about using nuclear weapons, the issues that might flow should we choose to do so. And they noted some of the following things. They said NATO would be badly shaken. They said once a taboo had been broken, there would remain no effective barrier to the expansion of such weapons. They said there would be great agitation in Japan, probably including the loss of facilities available to the United States. They said there would be accelerated momentum for nuclear proliferation, that there would be fundamental revulsion of the United States, including condemnation of the United States and the United Nations, that no British government that failed to condemn the U.S. would probably be able to stand, and that there'd be pressure for immediate nuclear disarmament. This were the list of things that they talked about, big consequences. Are these all kind of concerns that you all would share if the U.S. was to utilize a nuclear weapon against North Korea or another circumstance where it's essentially a conventional setting?
Senator, are you asking with respect to a first strike or a use of a weapon under any circumstance?
Use of a first strike with a U.S. nuclear weapon against conventional forces.
I'm sure some of those conditions in that report are enduring. I'm not sure all of them are. I'd need to study it and give it greater thought.
Secretary Mattis.
I'd have to study it, sir. I will just tell you that we have not been discussing this sort of thing in any kind of an actionable way.
Thank you. I am very, very pleased to hear that. I was very struck when I read this list that they would all be things that would probably stand up today if we were discussing them. The impact on NATO, our allies, world attitude toward us, the effect on the British government, and so forth. I was almost like, wow, it could be a list for today's conversation. Turning to the 2001 AUMF, my colleague from Kentucky, and please correct me if I get this wrong, but noted that most rational people looking at the 2001 AUMF would not see a connection to the uses in which it's being employed today. Did I get that right? And I have it here in my hand, and earlier, Secretary Tillerson, you noted that you weren't sure of the motivations behind that AUMF, but it's so clearly laid out in the whereases of that AUMF. And it is very specifically targeted to use all necessary and appropriate force against nations, organizations, or persons planning or authorized or committed or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred or harbored such organizations or persons. Completely about those 2001 attacks. The thing that I think all we're struggling with as a committee and our role in this constitutional balance is between a situation, a vision of the past in which our Constitution was framed around a declaration of war and then an executive who commanded forces in such wars, and the modern battlefield of the world in which there are terrorist groups scattered about, and whether what you're asking for, which sounds like permanent worldwide ability for the executive on its own to take on radical Islam. And that is quite a different vision than the one laid out in our Constitution. Am I describing it fairly in terms of, because I did hear no timeline, no geographic constraints, no restriction on type of operations. That sounds a whole lot like a permanent transition of power to the executive that really takes Congress out of the picture once such an AUMF would
Senator, that statement from the authorization goes on to say, in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. And I think you bring up a very valid point, because the Westphalian world that the Constitution was written in obviously has been thrown aside by these very powerful transnational groups that we see right now. And so however we deal with this to keep Congress's legitimate, strong constitutional power in play has got to recognize that traditional forms of warfare are no longer used. There are ways to do this. There's many variations that have been offered for AUMFs that could address this or in some ways will not address it. But I think we do have to recognize that Congress was very blunt that it was to prevent future acts of terrorism.
Yes, and it sure was, by such nations and organizations that had been involved in planning, authorizing, and assisting the terrorist attacks on September 11th. But often I hear, and I think we've heard it a number of times today, that this has been reinterpreted to involve any associated forces. Now, there is no wording in this of associated forces. And it's often, I find in just academic discussions, people think that those words exist in here. Now, I do understand that the point that organizations change names and fracture and move on. But we are quite distant in purpose and time from these groups which attacked us on 2001. And the challenge here is, what if one takes this associated forces as an add-on to this, an implication of this, then the question becomes, isn't almost anything associated in the world? And where is that line? And that's a challenge for this committee and in dialogue with the executive to figure out what is that line. And that's what we're struggling with. And I, for one, am not ready to concede that the line should be wiped out with no geographic limits, no time limits, no style of force limits.
Thank you very much. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretaries Tillerson and Mattis, for your leadership and your commitment to our country. A couple of questions. I believe, Secretary Mattis, you had stated that one of the advantages of Congress passing a new AUMF would be to show the resolve of Congress and the unity of Congress. What does that look like, though, a united Congress? Is that a filibuster-proof passage of an AUMF? Is that a 100-0 passage? What does a united passed AUMF look like?
Well, I'm not sure it would have to be 100%, sir, but it would have to show, I think, a bipartisan embrace of the definition of the threat, and then at least sufficient congressional support for what to do about that threat, that we would see America standing up saying that's where we stand, if that helps, Senator.
Under the AUMF that is currently in effect, has there been any material change to the authorities that you view, the President views the AUMF through, that President Obama had not already defined that way, utilizing the same authorities, same reasoning?
There's been some changes in the application.
The rules of engagement issues.
That sort of thing, but I can't think of any change in the authorities that we think we're operating under.
And has there been any additional AUMF grant of authority since President Obama left office over the last 10 months?
I don't believe so, sir.
If you move from a Title X type of action to an AUMF type of authorization, what would that require? What would that look like?
I think it would have to be an authorization that defines this enemy sufficiently that it does not restrict our operations in the field and sets a condition under which we are to fight for an objective.
So we're in the Philippines right now under Title X, is that correct? In the Philippines right now under Title X, is that correct? Do we have special operators in the Philippines?
Yes, sir, we do.
And are they under Title X? Well, assuming...
I know we've had them there under Title X. The difference is that now with the fight going on in Marawi, I believe we've reported them under other authorities as well, AUMF, but I'm not positive. I need to check on that.
So is that a presidential declaration? Is that a determination by you? I mean, is there a cold break between a Title X action and a 2001 AUMF action?
Well, if troops were to be sent into direct combat, which they are not in the Philippines, we're supporting again with intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, that would cause us under the War Powers Resolution to notify you of that. But I think we notify you of the troops there under our normal maintaining your knowledge of where we have troops deployed, not in a combat role.
Quickly here, because I want to move on to North Korea. Quickly here, what is the most significant rule of engagement change that we've seen right now in our fight against ISIS from the previous administration to this administration?
I believe it would be in Afghanistan where we have authorized the troops there not to have a requirement for proximity to the enemy. In other words, wherever we see them, we can attack them. They're declared hostile, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and there is no need for them to have to be in self-defense mode to call our air support, for example.
And that goes to your question, your point you made on lawfare earlier. They knew that, correct? Our enemy knew that. They could utilize that rule of engagement against us, and that's your point on lawfare, that they were protecting themselves based on a rule of engagement, correct?
Absolutely.
And we have made significant progress in the fight against terrorism because of a change in the rule of engagement, correct?
And the tactics we've employed, yes, sir.
Thank you. North Korea, Secretary Mattis, you said that North Korea was the most urgent national security threat facing our country. Do you still agree with that today?
I do.
Secretary Tillerson, do you agree with that?
I do.
has there been, I've heard comments about first strike and nuclear capabilities. Kim Jong-un, to our knowledge, has not given up his first strike capabilities. Is that correct?
Well, it's unclear what his striking capabilities are at this point from a nuclear perspective.
But should he have a nuclear weapon, has he given up a first strike possibility?
Not to my knowledge.
Secretary Mattis?
No, sir.
Has anything in our nuclear chain of command doctrine changed between the previous administration and this administration?
No, it has not.
So the chain of command, the response, the first strike, that is all the same, correct?
Yes, sir.
Secretary Tillerson, you may or may not wish to answer that.
No, as far as I'm aware, nothing has changed.
Thank you. Additional question on North Korea. You have said, Secretary Mattis, I believe, that if there was an action going into North Korea under Article 2, the President would obviously act if need be, but an AUMF would be required for further operations. Is that correct?
I would think an AUMF, a declaration of war, you know, it would depend on the circumstance. So I'd have to see the circumstances surrounding the requirement to engage in conflict, sir.
Thank you. And I know that you have made, at least in the last week, Secretary Tillerson, with the Department of Treasury, announced several new sanctions against Chinese entities. Are there more Chinese entities forthcoming in the sanctions as it relates to North Korea?
There are additional sanctioning targets that Treasury has developed.
Thank you. And I'm running out of time here, so a couple brief questions for you. Secretary Mattis, do you believe the Iraqi security forces' use of U.S. armor is legal under the Iraqi Constitution as it relates to what is taking place right now with the Kurdistan?
Sir, right now we've got a pause in the activity on both sides as a result of the referendum, and I think we are talking our way through it right now.
Well, I'd like to have an answer, though, on the Iraqi security forces' use of U.S. armor and whether that is legal under the Iraqi Constitution and whether Iranian involvement in the current situation could create further implications under U.S. law as it relates to the use of that equipment. That's one question I'd like to have an answer to. Second question relates to Section 702 reauthorization. I know Senator Kane mentioned FISA reauthorization earlier. Is the Department of Defense asking for Section 702 to be reauthorized as part of the Defense Authorization Act Conference Committee?
I need to talk with the President about that, sir.
Thank you.
Before turning to Senator Booker, I do think as we move through this, the lawfare issue that you brought up relative to Afghanistan, that was a significant problem. Our enemies were aware it existed, and they took advantage of it. And I think that was a very good line of questioning also. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here, and I appreciate your service to our country. Secretary Mattis, right now in Niger, it's becoming a pretty significant beneficiary of a lot of DOD activity, a lot of DOD funding under the Train and Equip, Global Train and Equip program. To my understanding, there's a new Air Force facility in Agadez amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars. Is that correct?
That's correct.
We're seeing a lot of talk now about continued military operations in the region, continued investment of U.S. troops as well as resources. Is that correct?
Senator, we've been operating in Niger and the surrounding area for about a little over 20 years now. Yes, sir.
But my point is that there's been a significant increase of recent.
There has been recently as we try to build them up to take care of their own security.
And at the same time, we're seeing that at least a proposed budget from the administration for food peace programs used to total about $33.8 million. The proposed budget is now being cut to $1.6 million for all bilateral aid to Niger. Is that correct, sir, to your knowledge?
I'm going to have to go back and look at the figure.
Those figures are correct, so in the proposed budget. So in other words, a massive ratcheting up of our military operations, a proposed decrease. Now, I bring that up to you really because, and I think I've heard you talk to this, but I'd like for you to speak to it now. You know, we're seeing in a lot of these states we're involved in Africa very different conditions often than we've seen in other places where we've been involved in train and equip programs or fighting in the sense of what's happening with in a lot of these countries. Let's turn to Nigeria for a second. Nigerian military forces have conducted significant crimes, I would say, massacres of Shia Muslims in the northeast town of Syria, in which over 350 people were killed. Nigerian Air Force bombed and displaced persons camp, killing 236 refugees, and injuring thousands more. In 2014, the military was accused of over 600 unarmed detainees, of killing over 600 unarmed detainees and interring them in mass graves. There has been very little progress or accountability for these incidents. And I guess I say to this because we seem to be involved in places like Nigeria, and you know that as we decrease efforts in stabilizing democracies, helping with food aid, creating an environment where there's stability, and we are involved in partnering with militaries that are responsible for atrocities, that creates an environment for more terrorism. Or do you disagree with that statement, Secretary Mattis?
Senator, what we try to do is maintain our diplomatic engagement, our development support, at the same time provide sufficient security, which is by training them how to do their own security, behind which the development can occur to remove the root causes. Anywhere you see U.S. troops, Senator, you will find them schooling local troops. Part of our training is the law of armed conflict, is military ethics. We're the good guys in trying to get this across.
I don't take issue with that at all. What I take issue with is that you're saying we try to maintain our efforts at diplomacy and food support because that's not reflected in budget numbers. Let me just continue to the point I was trying to make, that there's a lot of extensive research, which I'm sure you're aware, that in addition to socioeconomic status, excessive force by police and military forces engenders deep grievances that lead to radicalization. And the heavy-handed responses from military drives recruitment and violent extremism in organizations that often then lead to terrorist activity. You're aware of that research?
I'm not aware of what we'd done in May of 2014 when 276 Nigerian girls were kidnapped. I don't find the connection between our activities and Boko Haram's kidnapping of hundreds of girls.
I wasn't making that connection, sir. I'm simply making the point, as Senator Paul made within Yemen, for example, that when we're engaged in counterterrorism activities, partnering with military operations like we're seeing with Saudi Arabia, like we're seeing with the Nigerian forces, and they're conducting operations in a way in which civilians are killed, in which atrocities are accomplished, that, in your opinion, does that in any way often drive the creation or the conditions for radicalization?
I understand, Senator. It certainly could. I assure you what we're trying to do is to keep that from happening, those very things. And in this case, the United Nations recognized government in Yemen is fighting inside a civil war there to try to restore that government. And if we don't get it restored, then that will set the conditions for the very kind of growth of terrorist groups that you've mentioned.
In Somalia, the language of your current notification of June 27th says the United States forces also advise, assist, and now accompany regional forces. Is that a change that means that we could be accompanying regional forces, means a potential combat role for troops in Somalia?
Yes, sir. However, our mission there is still to train and advise and assist them by accompanying them how to carry out their own security. We're not taking over the fighting from the Somali or the Africa Union forces, AU forces.
So I've run out of time. I just want to say there's a whole bunch of more questions on a lot of the activities in Africa that I would love to get answers to, Mr. Chairman. I will also say that it strains my understanding of what an authorization of use of military force. I don't want to tell you what I was doing 16 years ago, but it really strains to me.
I'm sure we don't want to hear it.
Okay. It strains to me that this idea that somehow that authorization is being used. I don't care if it's Indonesia, where there's a terrorist activity, in the Philippines, Niger, Somalia. I can go through that we're still relying for all these activities. There's been no objective, in my opinion, a conversation had enough to see if we're really achieving U.S. aims or engaging in a way that is making this world a much more complex place. And I really do agree with a lot of my colleagues that we should be having this debate openly and more in Congress.
Thank you so much. Senator Brasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mattis, as we were discussing, you've just gotten back from Korea. Just right before this time today, you were at the DMZ and you said North Korea has accelerated the threat that it poses to its neighbors in the world through its illegal and unnecessary missile and nuclear weapons program. Well, today North Korea announced that it's going to be launching more, quote, satellites into space. And I'm just wondering, are these satellite launches simply just another way for North Korea to test ballistic missiles under the guise now of a space program?
The application of technology is by and large the same, sir.
And Secretary Tillerson, I want to switch a little bit to what I see happening in terms of recent confrontations between the government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government. I'm very concerned about the Christians and the minority communities in the disputed territories that are being impacted by this. There have been recent media reports of 700 to 1,000 Christian families forced to flee their homes in Tel Ascaf, a Christian town about 19 miles north of Mosul. Many of these Iraqi Christians recently just were able to return to their home, to their villages after ISIS had forced them out of the area. So could you just spend a little time explaining what are you hearing from Christian leaders in these communities and what the U.S. is doing to ensure the Christian and other vulnerable minorities are being protected?
Senator, well, the good news is they're trying to get back to their homes, their villages, their traditional homes that they fled when ISIS entered the area. And many of their villages have been spared because the fighting did not occur there. We've been in direct contact with Christian leaders in those communities who are concerned that this conflict between Kurdish Peshmerga forces and Iraqi central government forces not be fought out in their villages, and as a result they have pulled their forces out. Prime Minister Abadi has ensured that his forces stay out of those villages, and I think, to my knowledge, the Kurdish forces have pulled out of those villages as well. So we have direct engagement with local leaders of those communities and Christian leaders that are trying to bring those populations back.
Yeah, thank you. Secretary Mattis, earlier this month there were violent clashes between the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga in northern Iraq. The media reports indicated that the Iraqi government had moved forces into the disputed areas and the region of Kurdistan. So I'm wondering, what impact does the fighting have on our efforts of the U.S.-led international coalition against ISIS in terms of the ability to move military equipment and supplies to allied forces in Iraq and in Syria?
Senator, the fighting has disrupted and delayed some of those movements of our equipment, logistics support, ammunition, for example. But I would point out that the Iraqi forces moved into areas short of the 2004 Green Line. And as a result, although there were some firefights along there, Secretary Tillerson has been engaged diplomatically. We always lead diplomatically on all of our efforts, and those have been successful. And Prime Minister Abadi has, in effect, been able to hold things under control, make certain none of the militias are creating more problems as the Kurds sort out their political situation in Erbil.
Thank you. And in terms of moving first diplomatically, if I could, Secretary Tillerson, turn to Pakistan. August 21st, President Trump gave a primetime address to announce his strategy for Afghanistan. He said a pillar of that strategy was, as he said, to change the approach and how to deal with Pakistan. You briefly discussed this issue while you were traveling in the region last week. You said that you have given to Pakistan, you said, I think, certain expectations we have of their government. You went on to say that you were attempting to put in place a mechanism of cooperation through information sharing and action to be taken to begin to deny these organizations the ability to launch attacks. So could you talk a little bit about what is the change in the approach to Pakistan and maybe some of the expectations that you've articulated for the Pakistani government that you could share with the committee in terms of what this cooperation is going to look like?
Well, I can share some broad contours, and if there's an interest in more detail, we might need to do that in a closed hearing. But the conversation with the Pakistani government is for them to recognize that they will be one of the greatest beneficiaries of a successful peace process in Afghanistan. Pakistan lives with two very unstable borders, one with Afghanistan, one with India. And our message to them is you have to begin to create greater stability inside your country, and that means denying safe haven to any of these organizations that launch attacks from your territory. So we are going to enter into an effort to have greater sharing of certain intelligence information. The Pakistanis have indicated if we provide them information, they will act. We're going to have to test that, give them an opportunity to do so. And so what will change is that Pakistan will find it in their interest to begin to disassociate these long-standing relationships that have developed over time with certain terrorist organizations, the Haqqani Network, the Taliban, inside of Pakistan, which may have served their purpose for stability once upon a time, but they no longer serve that purpose. And it's up to Pakistan, I think, to think about their longer-term stability and their future by changing that relationship with these organizations.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for your leadership and your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis, for being here and for your service and your stamina, frankly, that we're still here. Over the past several years, as has been pointed out in this discussion, the range of threats that we face from terrorist groups and state actors has become increasingly diverse, fragmented, and geographically expansive. And militants that we defeat in one country have spread their ideology and violence to other areas. Similarly, state actors like Iran and Russia are increasingly expanding their reach beyond their borders, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, where our troops are present. So I'm concerned, as many on this committee are, that without an adequate understanding of the parameters that the administration is using to justify the use of force, that our strategies will remain ambiguous and that our troops will have few limits to where they will be asked to go and what they will be asked to do. And I have to say that I believe in the importance of U.S. engagement in the world, so I'm not an isolationist. I don't think we should withdraw from everywhere. But I want to make sure, as Senator Booker said, that we're actually achieving the aims that we set out to achieve when we put troops in a particular area. And Secretary Tillerson, as you point out, the American people and our soldiers have a right to know where they're being asked to go, what they're being asked to do, what the expectations are, and what the end game is. And I think one of the places where it's not at all clear to me what the end game is and that we have a strategy for that end game is in Syria, which is, the conflict there is one of the things that has allowed terrorist groups and ISIS to metastasize in the way that they have. So as we look at the liberation of Raqqa, what is our end game for fighting ISIS along the middle Euphrates River? Do we intend to continue down the Euphrates to Mayadin? Will the Assad regime or the Russians do that? It's not at all clear, and we have not just the terrorists that we're fighting there, but we also have those state actors, Russia, Syria, Iran, who are playing a role that's complicating the situation. So I guess this is for you, Secretary Mattis.
Senator, it is the most complex battlefield I think I've ever experienced. I would tell you right now that, again, our operational aspects of our strategy are by, with, and through partnered or allied forces. That's why you see us helping others learn how to fight or putting our people, in this case in Syria, in a position to resupply them. Basically, we, I believe, lost one soldier killed taking Raqqa, and the Kurds lost over 600 killed. You see it written in the grimmest possible statistic. What we will do is, knowing they've moved their external operations elements down toward Mayadin, as we gather strength from the Arab tribes, we certainly will continue to move against ISIS, and because this thing isn't over until it's over. At the same time, the pro-regime forces, I'm talking about Iranian-supported elements, Lebanese Hezbollah, and the Russian forces are moving from Dar ez-Zor in the same direction. Again, we do deconfliction, as you know, with them at several levels. So we'll continue to move against them. The Iraqis will move against them from their side of the border, even as this Kurdish referendum issue has been a distraction further north. They are continuing to move. So we're still on the move. We're still deconflicting, and Secretary Tillerson is coordinating the larger issue of the end state diplomatically.
And so is the expectation as we drive ISIS out that we will leave that remaining sections of Syria to Assad, to the Russians, to Iran? Because it's not at all clear that once we're gone, what will happen in those territories.
Well, Senator, that's where our diplomatic efforts are underway to create these de-escalation zones. That as areas are liberated, we then de-escalate the conflict so that the civil war does not re-erupt. And in order for that to happen, that means that the regime hold its positions and not try to overrun or retake areas that were liberated by others. We've successfully put one de-escalation zone in the southwest of Syria in conjunction with Jordan and Russia. That de-escalation zone went into effect January the 9th. There have been no aerial bombings in that area since, and we have had success moving Iranian presence as well as Lebanese Hezbollah presence out of those areas. We're working to create additional de-escalation zones, and these are not demarcation zones. These are not intended to divide the country. They're merely intended to de-escalate, deconflict, and in effect get ceasefires in place so that we then can get representatives to the Geneva process pursuant to the UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which has a very prescribed process for how Syria will work its way towards new elections over the next few years.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt. I would like to pursue this discussion in a classified setting, but I did want to follow up on a statement that you made, Secretary Mattis, where you said that we always lead with diplomacy. I would like to think that we always lead with diplomacy, but given the current reorganization at the State Department, the current cuts to the budget at the State Department that were requested by this administration, the number of personnel, the amount of years of expertise of people who have left the State Department. I guess I question whether, in fact, we are leading with diplomacy and putting our best foot forward. So I don't know, Mr. Secretary, can you explain to me why this is a good time to let go those personnel to cut back on the budget of the State Department?
We've let no one go, Senator. Some people have retired. Some people have chosen to leave and pursue other interests on their own. There's been no layoffs. There's been no terminations. And quite frankly, Senator, I have to speak on behalf of the professional men and women at the State Department, Foreign Service officers and others who have many, many years of experience that have stepped up to the open positions that are still open because we're waiting for confirmations and are doing a superb job representing the American people's interest. And our diplomacy has not stopped. It is not hampered. It is not slowed. These people are engaged directly with our counterparts leading this diplomatic effort. I'm proud of them. They're doing a great job, and we need some more help. We need some leadership help. But we haven't depleted our ranks of expertise by any stretch of the imagination. And quite frankly, on their behalf, I want to defend their expertise too.
Well, I certainly was not attacking the men and women of the State Department. I think they do an excellent job. And my concern is that we've seen many people with a lot of expertise who have left the department because they're concerned about the direction there. And that's what I wanted to speak to. But I share your support for the work that they're doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So, General Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, in an increasingly dangerous and volatile world, I'm glad you are where you are. And we've got a lot of challenges, and I think the current AUMF covers the fight against ISIS, even though, as was stated earlier, 15 years ago, there was no ISIS as such. However, I also believe having a new AUMF has benefits. I think it can be worthwhile in providing greater clarity and guidance, including to our military commanders and to your diplomats, Mr. Secretary. I think it can help you establish a firmer base of political support for overseas operations. I think it can send a clear signal of resolve from the United States Congress as well as the administration to friend and foe alike. And so I'm interested, but I'm only interested in the right AUMF. It's got to be helpful in empowering those who are undertaking this incredibly important task during a time of such danger. I guess my question to you would be, I understand, looking at your testimony and having been here earlier, that you have laid out what you think the guiding principles ought to be, but are there any authorities or guidance that you now lack that a new AUMF could provide?
On the military side, Senator, I would just, I would say no as it stands right now. And again, when I spoke, I just thought that we need to incorporate those factors that I brought up. I'm not telling the Senate how to do its business. I just owe you my best military advice. How you deal with that, I salute, and we will carry out our orders to the Commander-in-Chief. But I think those factors of conditions-based and the timelines, anything that we do, we have to recognize has an impact on both our operations and on the enemy's view. And we just have to take that into account. That's a reality. And I am not saying that there's some prescriptive one way to solve these.
Secretary, any guidance or any authorities you lack?
I don't think there's any authorities we lack. As we indicated, we think the current authorizations we have are sufficient to allow us to pursue this enemy wherever they choose to want to fight us. And again, I think, you know, this is all about fighting them over there so they don't come here to attack us on the homeland again.
And the threat has evolved, and it will continue to evolve. And geographic limitations, as an example, would make no sense, I assume, given the fact that we've seen a metastasizing of the threat through countries we might never have imagined would be part of now ISIS or former Al-Qaeda. Let me ask you a broader question, and this is a tough one, but I have, as is true with many of my colleagues, been frustrated as you have with regard to Syria. You called it a very complex battlefield, and I know the President and our administration has focused on defeating ISIS as is appropriate. But there's a broader issue here, which is, you know, how did ISIS evolve in the first place? And how do we deal with the underlying problems and the chaos in that region, the instability that fueled the rise of ISIS in the first place? And I guess my question to you is, let's say we continue to be successful with ISIS. You talked about Raqqa earlier, and you talked about some of the military successes we've had on the ground. As we do that, I would think our coalition partners and us are going to see the limitations of a military approach, because you'll continue to have sectarian divisions, competing interests, a worsening humanitarian crisis. And I just want to be sure if we're doing a new AUMF, we cover that. In other words, this is not just to give you the authority to use military force, but it's really to get at the underlying causes so that we don't have to go back again. I guess, Secretary Tillerson, to ask you first, as an example, do you think there can be a lasting peace there as long as Assad is in power? And does the current AUMF give you the ability, General Mattis, to be able to deal with that issue if you think that has to be resolved? That might be one example.
Well, the current AUMF only authorizes our fight against ISIS in Syria. As I indicated in my remarks, we're not there to fight the regime. There is no authority beyond the fight against ISIS. Therefore, we have to pursue a future Syria that's kept whole and intact, and a process which the UN Security Council process does provide a process by which, in our view, the Assad regime will step down from power. How that occurs will be part of that process, and that's what we've continued to indicate. That is a view that's widely held by others in the region as well. It's a view that's widely held by our allies in Europe and broadly by the coalition. So what we want to do is create conditions so Geneva has an opportunity to succeed.
And again, how does this play into the potential new AUMF? And Secretary Mattis, you might focus, if you would, on the military operations side of this thing. In order to secure the peace after ISIS is defeated, if we're successful, what would you like to see in an AUMF that would be broader and give you the ability to do what has to be done?
Sir, I think the AUMF has to address the two basic brands of terrorism that we've seen strike at civilized people everywhere and determine what it takes to define that problem in sufficient detail and to a point that here in the Congress we're in agreement, if you go forward along those lines, so that we speak with one voice on the threat. If we spend time basically defining the threat in sufficient rigor, then I think much of the response to that threat will be understandable and supportable across the political spectrum.
Okay. And again, I know this is a sensitive topic, but do you think a broader AUMF is needed to deal with the underlying issues? Not just the immediate elimination of the ISIS threat in Syria, but some of the factors that have led to the rise of ISIS.
It could do that, Senator. Properly constructed, it could do that.
I think it's a question of, after we are successful, as we're having success now, how do you stabilize these areas? And is there any military role for that stabilization? I'm not, I'd have to think about it further as to whether it's a military role or whether it's really, we equip, which is what we're doing today, we equip local capacity to maintain the security of their communities. And as I said, and as Prime Minister Abadi noted, armies are not good at police, as serving in a police role. They're not trained for that. So we have to train security forces that are able to provide a policing function to maintain stability and security for these communities, which helps tamp down the conditions that give rise then to this violent extremism again.
No question. I guess I'm just again, I'm out of time, and I appreciate your condolence in allowing me to go a little over, Mr. Chairman. But I do think this is a discussion that we can have as part of this potential new AUMF is, what is the broader strategy here that we ought to be pursuing to avoid getting back in the fight again? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And before I turn to Senator Cardin for his closing comment, on that note, I mean, you guys, I just want to be clear, people are tuned into this, you're not asking for an authority to go against Assad.
No, Senator.
And if you attempted,
No,
if you felt you needed to go against Assad as part of the broader picture that Senator Portman was bringing up, you would come to Congress because we would then be going against a country. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Senator
Well, Mr. Chairman, I first want to thank both of our witnesses for their service to our country and their participation in this hearing. There may be some disagreements about what the AUMF covers currently and what Congress should include in a more up-to-date AUMF. That's a healthy debate that we're having. There is no debate, as the chairman's pointed out, about our resolve to go after terrorists who are attacking our interests and our allies, and we want you to have the ability to root them out and destroy them. So there's no disagreement about that. I just would sort of conclude on this, and that is, I think there's a real willingness of all of us to try to work together to modernize the AUMF. So we're going to try to be able to do that. But I particularly want to thank you for the direct answers to our questions. I think you were very clear in responding to the questions that have been asked by the members of this committee, and that's very encouraging because this hearing, I think, has been extremely helpful to us to try to sort out how we can best represent the national security interests of this country.
I agree. I want to thank you both for coming, for your service to our country, for the concrete answers that you gave. Obviously, the next logical step is for us to mark up an AUMF. And I would just ask while you're here, that you agree to work with us promptly, and the work period's short. We've got other issues to deal with, and that you would both use your resources to respond quickly to questions we might have legally and otherwise relative to an AUMF.
Will do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Again, thank you so much. There will be additional questions that will be, we'll take those through the close of business Wednesday. To the extent you can answer those promptly, considering the other duties you have, we'd appreciate it. Again, I cannot thank you enough for your service and for the time you spent with us today, and with that, the meeting's adjourned.